In early August of 1415, a vast Portuguese armada approached the coast of North Africa near the Strait of Gibraltar. Its primary objective, the city of Ceuta, came into view. The fleet consisted of 59 galleys, 33 carracks, and 120 support vessels. On board were 20,000 troops, with an additional 30,000 support personnel. The force was multinational, consisting of not only Portuguese men, but also recruits and mercenaries from France, England, and Germany. Years of meticulous planning went into this attack, which was arranged in the utmost secrecy. The invasion force was led by the warrior King John I of Portugal, and by his side were his 3 sons, including his heir, Prince Edward. Ceuta was a fabulously wealthy city, a place where the trade route for North Africa ended, and it was extremely strategic, being well placed on the Strait of Gibraltar. As such, its defenses were impressive. Over the centuries, it had been built into a fortress, defended by high walls and impressive towers. The Marinid dynasty, the current owners, had even gone so far as to add an imposing citadel. The Portuguese arrived with their fleet on August 12, 1415. As they entered the harbor, they immediately came under bombardment from the city. This initially prevented the Europeans from making landfall. Meanwhile, the governor of the city, Salah bin Salah, ordered the women and children to depart and brought in as many reinforcements as he could find. However, the Marinid Sultan, Abu Sayyad Usman III of Fez, due to massive internal upheaval that bordered on civil war, was unable to send in any further troops. King John of Portugal managed to reorganize his men for an attack on August 16th, but that very night, a strong gale descended on the fleet, which literally scattered it to the wind. The next morning, with the Portuguese fleet absent, the defenders of the city came to the conclusion that the Europeans had given up. The governor, Salah bin Salah, made the decision to release his reinforcements, leaving only a small garrison, a decision he'd soon regret. It was on August 21st, 1415, that King John returned in force once again. Against the odds, he had brought his fleet together, and his soldiers were eager for battle. As before, the fleet sailed into the harbor. Landing craft that were loaded with troops were lowered into the water and then quickly made their way to the beaches. However, as the king was making his way to the shore, he was shot and wounded in the leg. His men began to falter. It was at this point that his son, a man by the name of Prince Henry, took up the royal standard and led the attack onwards. Flanked by his brother, Prince Edward, the heir to the throne, and supported by 300 men, Henry advanced to the Al-Madinah Gate, which was poorly defended. Due to the speed of Henry's attack, the gate was not properly secured and was soon smashed open. A massive breach would follow as King John arrived at the gate with the rest of the army. The Portuguese poured into the city and brushed aside the defenders. This small, outnumbered garrison was able to resist fiercely at first, but eventually they had to break and run. Salah bin Salah retreated to his citadel, but he remained there only for a night. It was during that night that he realized that his options were very limited. He decided to use the cover of darkness and fled the city as well. The very next day, all resistance in Ceuta came to an end, at which point the flag of Lisbon was hoisted above the battlements of the city. The Portuguese Empire had begun. By the late 14th century, Portugal was a relatively impoverished nation. When King John came to power on April 6, 1385, he inherited a kingdom that seemed to have a relatively dismal future. The kingdoms of Central Europe, on the other hand, were growing as the Renaissance in certain areas was beginning. The city-states of Italy, especially Genoa and Venice, which had a monopoly on trade to the Orient, were growing immensely wealthy. As can be imagined, this was envied by just about everybody else. Portugal, meanwhile, was missing out. It was on the extreme periphery. As the writer John Crowley would say, it was the prow of Europe. The kingdom had a long coastal border that looked on towards a menacing, seemingly endless Atlantic Ocean. An ocean, by the way, that the Arabs would call the Green Sea of Darkness. To the east, Portugal was blocked by its powerful and aggressive neighbor Castile. Indeed, a few months after King John had come to power, Castile invaded with a strong army. At the Battle of Aljubarrota on August 14, 1485, the Portuguese king, despite being outnumbered by nearly 5 to 1, achieved a decisive victory. His position as a sovereign was secured, and the House of Gyges, which he founded, would last for nearly 200 years. In the aftermath of this battle, King John was able to focus on the task of expanding his realm. 30 years later, he and his sons stood as conquerors of the city of Ceuta. Roger Crowley in the book Conquerors describes this moment well. Quote, "The Portuguese had come to wash their hands in infidel blood. They fulfilled their contract to the letter. 3 days of pillage and massacre then ransacked a place once described as the flower of all other cities in Africa, its gateway and its key. This stunning coup served notice to European rivals that this small kingdom was self-confident, energetic, and on the move." End quote. On August 24th, 1415, in what had once been the city's mosque, now converted into a church known as Our Lady of Africa, a rightfully proud King John knighted his sons. Prince Henry's moment had finally come. The prince, who would be known to history as Henry the Navigator, looked at the city of Ceuta and saw a vast, untapped potential. In his mind, he saw North African caravans bringing in the spices from the east. He glimpsed the trans-Saharan trade routes, bringing in the legendary gold of Mount Musa. Henry didn't have to look much further than the Catalan Atlas of 1375 to reaffirm his beliefs. There, he would see the mighty African king holding up a gold coin in his hand, sitting near the fabled river of gold. Mansa Musa's famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, where he brought so much gold that it devalued its worth, obviously had an effect on the European mind. But the knighted prince, not just a warrior, but also a man with a talent for seizing opportunity, saw much more. He observed a way of cutting out the middlemen of Genoa and Venice, and getting directly to the spice markets of Alexandria and Damascus. He saw an ability to outflank the growth of Islam. Indeed, his later ventures of exploration would be billed to the Pope as crusades. What's more, he believed that by exploring Africa, a way could be found to reach Prester John. Prester John was believed to be an extremely powerful Christian king who had a vast empire someplace to the east. His tale emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries as the Crusades were being pushed back by Islam. The belief was that if Europe could only reach Prester John, then perhaps he would unleash his armies and destroy the caliphate in a combined attack. Prince Henry's mind was made up. Portugal would have to expand, and thus it would need to explore, or face a slow death of obscurity. For Henry, Ceuta was just the beginning. It was a city that needed to be a firm part of Portugal's domain. When his father, King John, placed him in charge of Ceuta's defense, he took the job extremely seriously. Thus, 4 years later, in 1419, when the Marid Sultan Abu Sayyad Uthman III launched a major attack on the city, Henry quickly sailed his fleet to alleviate the Muslim siege. But by the time he arrived, the commander of his garrison had daringly sallied forth and destroyed the besiegers. The Muslims were forced to fall back, and the Sultan Uthman was later assassinated in Fez in 1420 for his failure. The Marinid Sultanate would descend into anarchy, and Ceuta would face little opposition in the coming years. Prince Henry, on the other hand, got the credit for the win. On May 25th, 1420, he was appointed the Grand Master of the Order of Christ. This was a religious organization that was considered the successor to the now dissolved Knights Templar. The position brought him a lot of prestige, and a steady source of income that he was more than eager to use. Henry was now set to further his ambitions. In the city of Sagres, located in the southernmost part of Portugal, he was renowned as establishing his famous school of navigation. Now, it needs to be mentioned that there was not much evidence that Henry actually built a physical school. The truth of the matter is that he probably just brought together cartographers, sea captains, sailors, pilots, men that were willing to explore and compile their information, and the prince provided a platform, likely just a collection of buildings that he owned for these men to congregate and to engage in discourse. Either way, more detailed maps were created. Sailing tools like the compass and the astrolabe were better utilized and studied, and as a result, the Portuguese began to take a commanding lead on venturing into the unknown. Henry also made an important decision that would forever affect maritime history. He simply wanted a better ship. The answer that he and his team came up with was known as the caravel. The caravel was based on a Portuguese fishing vessel weighing approximately 80 tons with a shallow draft, which made it ideal for exploring estuaries and coastal waters. However, its design also functioned very well on the open ocean, which thus far had been a major obstacle. Triangular sails, possibly of Arab origin, known as lateen sails, allowed it to sail against the wind, albeit in a zigzag pattern. It also had 2 or 3 masts, some of which were rigged with square sails in order to give it better speed. The rudder was expanded for greater maneuverability, and a forecastle and a stern castle were incorporated, giving the ship a better defensive edge. It didn't require a large crew, which allowed for longer voyages. Most importantly, the ship could not only sail out, but it could also return in relative safety. Therefore, the design became an astounding success, and later variants of the caravel would be larger, better equipped, and have heavier weaponry. The stage for exploration was now set. In 1419, Henry sponsored a voyage to Africa which got blown off course, but inadvertently discovered the Madeira archipelago, located approximately 250 miles west off the coast of Morocco. Henry's men landed on one of the islands and established a new colony which would be named Porto Santo. The islands of the Madeira archipelago would be a blessing to the expansion of Portugal. It would serve as the base of operations and a stepping stone to new discoveries. What's more, the islands served as a vast source of timber, perfect for ship construction. Madeira, by the way, in Portuguese, means wood. Prince Henry also saw here an opportunity to create a plantation system to grow crops, like sugarcane. This endeavor would be vastly successful, and 80 years later, more sugar was produced on these islands than any other place in the world. This plantation system would later be reinforced with fortified trading outposts known as fetorias, roughly translated factories. Fetorias and plantations would prove another major success. In fact, in time, they'd be set up in most of the lands that Portugal would eventually claim. The discoveries would continue. Later in 1439, the Azores were colonized and incorporated into the empire. These islands would also serve as a base of operations and a springboard for further exploration. However, for Henry, his main goal was always pushing south along the west coast of Africa. Roger Crowley, again in Conquerors, explains, quote, Henry, the navigator, continued to sponsor expeditions down the coast of Africa in search of slaves, gold, and spices. Year by year, headland by headland, Portuguese ships worked their way down the southwestward sloping bulge of West Africa, cautiously sounding with plumb lines as they went, forever wary of shoals and reefs, over which the sea broke in pounding surf. In the process, they began to delineate the shape of a continent. The desert coasts of Mauritania, the lush tropical shores of the region they called Guinea, and the great rivers of equatorial Africa, the Senegal and the Gambia. Under Henry's direction, exploration, raiding, and trading went hand in hand with ethnographical curiosity and mapping. End quote. Henry's explorers continued to push the boundary of the known world. As they made their way, they put up large stone pillars that had crosses on top, known as padraos, which would serve as markers.
Come
Later,
on, this
outposts
game,
and
man.
trading
Like, it's
stations were also
fucking...
established. Gold was found and shipped back. While it wasn't a massive haul, it was enough for the Portuguese crown to start minting gold coins known as cruzado. It was also during these expeditions that the slave trade would also begin to ramp up. By 1444, 240 slaves were brought back and paraded for sale in the harbor of Lisbon. In the next 15 years, another 20,000 slaves, men, women, and children, would be brought back as well. This would establish the beginning of the slave trade that would persist for more than 300 years. Make no mistake, this would make Portugal rich, but it would have devastating effects on the economy of Africa. In all, Henry funded over 14 expeditions. Not all of them would be successful, but those that did return would bring back not just potential for more trading opportunities, but also invaluable information on the tides, the currents, the local wildlife, the winds, and the people, which were all compiled together and guarded with extreme secrecy. Eventually, even the infamous Cape Bojador was overcome. Before Prince Henry, this cape was a major obstacle on account of its harsh winds and strong currents. It was said that beyond were waters that could boil a man alive, and sea monsters of ever-increasing magnitude. After Prince Henry, this cape was only a marker that was passed by, as Portugal continued to extend further and further south along the African coast. However, not everything that Henry the Navigator did was successful. He was defeated by Castile when he attempted to take the Canary Islands, and in 1437 he attempted to take Tangiers in Morocco, as the North African trade routes had been diverted away from Ceuta to the city. It turned out to be a complete disaster. Tangiers was too well defended. Portugal didn't have enough troops or siege equipment, and eventually the entire Portuguese army got trapped there. Henry was forced to trade in his own brother, Ferdinand, as a hostage to allow for the Portuguese forces to retreat in peace. The prince was also obliged to hand over Ceuta, which he refused to do, and his brother would eventually die in a Muslim prison. Despite his failures, Prince Henry the Navigator had set a powerful precedent for his country. While he wasn't an explorer himself per se, he definitively got the ball rolling. Those that would follow in his footsteps would continue to explore, create maps, design better ships, find new trade routes, not to mention, frankly, exploiting the rapidly expanding world around them for personal gain and glory. Portugal, as a result of his actions, would take an early lead in the Age of Discovery. While it never had the
man.
to have a big land empire, it did have the motivation and the cunning to be a serious trade empire. In 1460, Henry died. He was interred in the Batalha Monastery in central Portugal. In retrospect, the prince would be regarded as one of the founding fathers of Portugal's empire, but he would also be a major figure in maritime history in general. His contribution, after all, could not be overlooked. 26 years after his death, the word descobrimento would appear in written form in Portuguese for the first time in recorded history. When translated into English, this word meant discovery. In late December of 1487, two caravels were making their way through the vast uncharted waters along the coast of Africa. No European had ever been this way. They were pushing the final frontier back, but were truly sailing into the unknown. Suddenly, a powerful storm hit the ships, pushing them from the relative safety of coastal waters and far out
No
into the
boost. The
open
double
ocean.
roll. I was hoping I get a boost. The double roll. That was insane.
The storms began to abate that the commander of the ships, a nobleman by the name of Bartholomew Diaz, made a very fateful decision. Instead of immediately heading due east to reclaim the side of land, he instead allowed the westerly winds
Should have gone left straight there. Fuck. Okay, it's
Nature
fine.
moved the ships further to the west and then to the south. Eventually, their course would turn them northeast. For 30 extremely tense days, as supplies and morale dwindled, there was no sight of land whatsoever. Had this been a massive mistake, had Bartholomew Diaz condemned his men to a slow death on the ocean? Then, suddenly on February 3rd, 1488, emerging from the distant horizon, land was finally spotted. The two ships quickly made their way to disembark, but once they made landfall, the real question remained. Where exactly had they arrived at? Was this just another bay on the seemingly endless coastline of Africa? Was the Ptolemaic principle, which stated that the Indian Ocean was a closed-off, inaccessible body of water, correct? Or had this Portuguese explorer just discovered the tip of Africa, and in so doing had uncovered the fabled passage to India with all the wealth that it held? In the early part of the 1400s, Portugal had taken a commanding lead on exploration.
What? How did that even know?
Known as Henry the Navigator, had been a massive proponent and patron of exploration and technological development. He had set the standard that his countrymen would adopt and eagerly follow. By the time of his death in 1460, Portuguese ships had discovered and colonized the Madeira Islands, the Azores, and the Cape Verde archipelago. The western coast of Africa had been explored to the sub-Saharan regions, but Portugal was only getting warmed up. In 1471, Fernão Gomes arrived in what is now modern-day Ghana to discover a flourishing gold trade, which gave rise to the name, the Gold Coast.
Oh, I got the door. I don't know. I don't think it's fast enough.
This Portuguese explorer would continue south, and by 1486, he had reached Cape Cross in present-day Namibia. As the Portuguese made their way down the coast of Africa, forts and trading posts were established, harbors and ports were constructed, and pedraos, which were stone pillars crowned with a cross that served as markers, were erected nearly to the Tropic of Capricorn. However, despite these successes, for the King of Portugal, this was simply not enough.
Oh, fuck this game.
The House of Aviz, the ruling dynasty of Portugal at that time.
That's fine. That's fine. That's fine.
When his father died in 1481, he became King of Portugal and proved to be a very capable ruler. John II was a Renaissance man. Alongside his father, he had conquered lands in North Africa, taken the city of Tangier, and had distinguished himself at the Battle of Toro against Castile in 1474. But aside from simply leading men into combat, John had a very talented mind for exploration and commerce. This Portuguese king was renowned for having two major obsessions. First, he wanted to find a way to get to India, and second, he wanted to reach the legendary Prester John. India made complete economic sense. It was the source of the spice trade, after all, and therefore it would be the source of immense wealth. Prester John was the epitome of the crusading desire to vanquish Islam. This fabled Christian king was said to have an incredible treasury and vast armies under his command. Now, theoretically speaking, if only the Christians could reach him, then he could unleash his forces, and perhaps the caliphate could be crushed. By the 15th century, it was determined that Prester John was no longer in Asia, but now someplace in Africa. Roger Crowley, in the book Conquerors, explains just how devoted King John was to accomplishing these goals. Quote, the king had gathered around him a loyal generation of highly talented pilots, sailors, and adventurers, chosen for their talents rather than their social status. In 1486, he energetically planned a three-pronged approach to solving the India problem and locating Prester John. First and foremost, a focused expedition would attempt to sail around Africa. Second, along the way, it would drop off Portuguese-speaking native Africans to seek information about the legendary Christian king in the interior of the continent. And third, an overland expedition to the east would be conducted using Arabic speakers who could penetrate the heartlands of the Indies to learn about spice spices, Christian kings, and the possibility of sailing routes to the Indian Ocean. John appointed a knight of his household by the name of Bartholomew Diaz to command the next expedition down the African coast. For the overland expedition, the king recruited Pero de Covija. Covija was about 40 years old, a quick-witted, multi-talented adventurer of lowly birth. He was also an adept swordsman, a loyal servant to the Portuguese king, and a spy. It was Covija and another Arabic speaker, Afonso de Paiva, to whom the king now entrusted this daring overland operation. End quote. In the spring of 1487, Covija and Paiva set out from Barcelona and sailed across the Mediterranean to arrive in Rhodes. In the city of Rhodes, they purchased the entire ship's hold worth of honey so they could pass as merchants. They then promptly made their way south, arriving at the port of Alexandria in Egypt. The two blended in and immediately got to work gathering intelligence, spying on the incoming merchants to discover any hint of the trade routes to the east. But shortly after they arrived, both of the king's men were bedridden with fever. Meanwhile, far to the west, Bartholomew Diaz was preparing a journey of his own. At the time, he wouldn't know it, but this voyage he was about to undertake would have a dramatic effect on world history. Bartholomew Diaz was born about 1450 into the aristocracy. He had the favor of King John II and was a member of his court. He came from a line of sailors and had gained a considerable amount of experience on other expeditions along the African coast. In 1482, he joined an expedition to present-day Ghana to establish the fortress of Elmina on the Gold Coast, which, by the way, gave Portugal a very firm hand on the gold trade. It has been suggested that Diaz was also a part of Cow's discovery of the Congo River. Sadly, very little is known of Diaz's exploits in early life, as the Portuguese kept his records a state secret, likely to keep that information from falling into the hands of rivals, and later an earthquake in 1755 destroyed those archives. In July or August of 1487, Diaz was given 3 ships by the crown. 2 were caravels, the Sao Pantaleo, and his flagship, which he personally commanded, the Sao Cristavo. The third was a square-rigged support ship which Diaz placed his brother Pero in charge of. On board the ships, Diaz had brought several padraos that he would embed as markers and 6 African slaves, 4 women and 2 men. The Africans had been taught Portuguese, had been adorned in fine clothing, and were given offerings of silver and gold. They would be dropped off at various spots in Africa to serve as ambassadors, to proclaim the glory of the Portuguese and to inquire about Prester John. Their fate, however, is lost to history, and it would seem that little was gained by this endeavor. Diaz set out from Lisbon. He stopped in Ghana at the Elmina fortress to take on more supplies, and then continued further south. Eventually, he passed the last padrao, placed at Cape Cross by Diogo Cao the year before.
Come on, man.
December 8th, 1487, he arrived at Walvis Bay in present-day Namibia, where the supply ship and 9 men were parked. Most of the supplies were transferred to the caravels, and the voyage would continue on.
What was that sidestep? Did you see that sidestep? Like what?
The caravels sailed into a storm, which pushed them from the coast into open waters, at which time a monumental choice was made. Roger Crowley explains, quote, "The pilots took a startling decision. At about 29 degrees south, they gave up the attritional battle with the adverse winds and currents. Instead, they turned their ships away from the shore, lowered their sails to half-mast, and flung themselves out into the void of the westerly ocean, with the counterintuitive aim of sailing east, eventually. No one knows exactly why this happened. It may have been a maneuver worked out in advance, or it may have been a moment of genius. An intuition, a gut feeling about the Atlantic winds based on previous experiences. Whatever the logic, this was a decisive moment in the history of the world." End quote. For 30 days, Bartholomew Diaz and his men were alone on an endless ocean. The winds and the currents carried them to the west and then to the south. The weather became colder and colder as they traversed into the southernmost latitudes. Eventually, the currents and the wind began to push them to the northeast. On February 3rd, 1488, after being a month at sea, the exhausted and frightened crews saw land once again. They came ashore at a place that would be called the Bay of the Cowherds, later to be known as Mosul Bay. The question on everybody's mind was, well, where were they? No European had ever ventured this far. There simply was no other points of reference. Undaunted, Diaz ordered his men to sail due east. They traversed for another 200 miles along the coast. Then, irrefutably, the coast began to turn to the northeast and the weather began to get warmer. Diaz knew then and there that he had made it around Africa. On March 12, 1488, Diaz anchored at a bay near a rocky headland named Haiho, where he placed his furthest patrol. His supplies were now critical, and his men's morale was ready to break into open mutiny. However, he and his men agreed to travel for 3 more days. They arrived at a river they would call the Rio Infante. For Bartholomew Diaz, this was as far as his voyage would take him. As he sailed back, he saw his last patrol. The historian, João de Barros...
Yo, Toad, what up, bro? I could talk now. Yesterday I couldn't talk because it was late at night. What up, man? How are you, bro?
He was overcome by great sadness and deep
Sorry,
emotion, as if he was saying goodbye to a son banished forever. He had remembered the great danger faced by him and all
Big Toad, what up, bro?
how long they had journeyed to come only to this point. Then they
I think this is completely made AI. The voice in this, I think the script is AI, but it's interesting. It's truth.
in the promised land. End quote.
No way. Yeah, they're doing that in a lot. Dude, in Orleans, they now have Indians. Indians are amazing. I love Indians, but they have Indians helping you in quotes at self-checkout, and they just like pester you with signing up for a credit card. They just won't. They won't. They try to shame you. They're like, oh, you can save all this money and all this shit. And I'm like, bitch, you don't know my fucking. Like, just fuck off.
He then boarded ship once again, and after a week on the ocean, he arrived in India, at the city of Calicut, in autumn of 1486.
Is that voice narrating? Nah, bro, I'm Z's incarnate. Just kidding. It's a voice narrating. Don't it sound? It could be this. It's self-aware, man. That is haram. Yeah, really.
Everything as he went, from the water currents to the prevailing winds, to the cities and the people that he encountered. He moved along the western seaboard of
There's like this like middle-aged Indian woman in a sari.
Eventually, he embarked on another
I was like, you're fucking like you should be at home with your fucking like grandchildren, not trying to force me to buy a credit card at the self-checkout at Walmart. But times are hard, man.
Surprisingly, 2 Portuguese messengers that had been dispatched by the king managed to find him. They would take his valuable report back to King John II. However, Covilhã's travels had made him a man that was no longer capable of going home. He soon discovered that his companion Paiva had died while seeking Prester John. Roger Crowley describes Covilhã's amazing journey and journey's end. Quote,
Dude, I got a second interview for the Covanta Reworld position, in Canada, the in Chambly and Kitchener, with the floor processing managers. It's probably gonna be next week. So I got by the first round. I'm just gonna put my best foot forward.
He was discovered in the country 30 years later by a Portuguese expedition to whom he would tell a story. He remained in Ethiopia until the day he
I don't think it's it. I had the box, man. That box, I think, cost it.
Meanwhile, going back to 1488, Bartholomew Diaz was making his return journey. On his passage west, he became the first European to see the Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms, named after its incredibly unpredictable weather. He then rounded the tip of Africa again, making his way north. He arrived at his supply ship in Namibia in July of 1488. Of the 9 men he had stationed there, only 3 remained. The supply ship itself was unsalvageable. The undaunted explorer
I can't believe that was still 19. How fast was that run? Holy shit.
known to the Portuguese. He arrived back in Lisbon in December of 1488. Altogether, he had traveled for over a year and a half. His voyage was estimated to be approximately 16,000 miles, which, by the way, the circumference of the Earth is just shy of 25,000. When he arrived back, he was celebrated as being the first European to round the tip of Africa and firmly disprove the Ptolemaic doctrine. But King John II did not seem happy with him. It's unknown exactly what
Yo,
was said.
Stash, what up, bro?
Perhaps there was some resentment
What's up,
that
man?
he didn't make it to India. Either way, Bartholomew Diaz
I'm playing on your Switch. Thanks, bro.
He would
What's up?
never
Hope
be
you're
the
good.
leader of an expedition again. But that's not to say that the story of Diaz ends here. In retrospect, the king did make it a point to rename
We're going for the untied sleigh.
Das Tormentas,
Just chilling. Cool.
the
Nice.
storm,
Thanks, man.
and instead named it the Cape of Good Hope. This may have seemed like a simple PR move, but perhaps for the king it was a challenge to his countrymen to see who could push the limit further. To the credit of the Portuguese sense of exploration, that challenge would soon be accepted. Based on the work of Diaz, Paiva, and Covija, a new round of explorers would seek out that sea passage to India, which in the end was simply too tempting and ambitious a goal to pass up. Folks, I want to give a big shout out to the explorers.
No, why? Like, why?
As I've mentioned before, there's not that much known about Bartholomew Diaz.
I'm getting every time I get fucked by that card.
Helpful in my research.
Every fucking
Now,
run.
he's extremely kind to send me his material. If you get a chance, check out the Explorers podcast. I will post the link in the description of the video. On the vast, seemingly endless ocean, 4 ships were making their passage. The fleet was Portuguese, and the sailors on board had not seen land in 3 long weeks. But this was only a portion of the long journey that they had endured. Their voyage had been an impressive feat of navigation and exploration, never before attempted by a European. They had departed from Lisbon and had traveled for more than 10 months, going a distance that was equivalent to half the circumference of the Earth. The commander was a man named Vasco da Gama. He had been appointed directly by the King of Portugal for this task. He and his men together had made their way around Africa and then onwards into the vast unknown that was the Indian Ocean. For da Gama, this mission was more than just procuring a piece of the lucrative spice trade for his king. It was also a mission to secure a foothold for his religion. But his expedition had come very close to complete disaster numerous times. Vasco da Gama had seen his men fight the rigors of malnutrition, the ravages of disease, and the misfortunes of armed conflict. The question now remained, had it all been truly worth it? Suddenly, along the eastern horizon, emerging from the ocean mist, something came into view. It was not just land. What they saw was a vast row of impressive mountains that stretched along the entire horizon. This was no simple island. This was a subcontinent.
Insane.
In the final years of the 15th century, dramatic changes were happening in the Iberian Peninsula. Bartholomew Diaz had rounded the tip of Africa, and Pedro de Covilham had made it to the city of Calicut in India. The combined discoveries of these
And no. Yeah, exactly. No, it's not yet. It's shite. It's really shit. God, it was like fucking like 1 degree Celsius this morning. Afternoon was pretty shit. Yeah. I mean, today it was like 11 degrees. It said on the car, but it's a black car. So, and it was in the sun. It was not 11 degrees. I wore a toque and a scarf and a jacket. Damn, yeah. Oh, it's terrible. It's worse.
It was that year that neighboring Castile and Aragon had completed the Reconquista by defeating the last kingdom of Islam in Iberia. They soon afterwards expelled the Jews.
It's definitely not Miami.
Would find refuge in Portugal, but this relocation would put a considerable strain on the Portuguese crown. However, these events were soon to be eclipsed by one of the greatest flashpoints in history.
Yo, for sure, bro. I'd love to.
It was on March 3rd, 1493, that a ship struggled into the harbor of Restello, a small village near Lisbon. The name of the ship was the Santa Maria.
But dude, some news. So I didn't get offered the job in Qingdao, the beach city, but I got offered the position in Dongying. So I accepted the one in Dongying. Yeah, Dongying. I mean, I like Dongying. I mean, I like both. Dongying will be the one I make more money, I think, for sure.
Either way, a confrontation with Spain seemed inevitable as word of Columbus's voyage spread throughout Europe. King John immediately laid claim to
See by the water. Oh, thanks, man. Thanks, buddy. Rich history? What's it talking about? It's not true. It's not true at all. It's a brand new city, discovered because of its oil fields. What's it doing talking about Chinese food is delicious? That's retarded.
Who had managed to come to power just the year before. He was considered a Spaniard. Technically,
Wow, it actually completed. That's insane. Yeah, it is.
the two were on excellent terms.
It is, buddy. It is.
Castilian queen had cunningly chosen the Pope would pass several papal bulls to literally establish spheres of influence for the two Iberian powers. Though it needs to be mentioned, these documents heavily favored Castile. Kristen Downey in the book The Warrior Queen explains what happened next. Quote, the Portuguese naturally were not happy with the Pope's ruling. Queen Isabella and King João of Portugal therefore negotiated their own division of the globe. In talks that were held in Castile at the town of Tordesillas, the agreement that they reached on June 7, 1494, known as the Treaty of Tordesillas, pushed the north-south dividing line west 370 leagues, approximately 1,200 miles, from the islands of Cape Verde, instead of the Pope's 100 leagues to the west, thereby allowing Portugal to retain all rights to the coast of Africa.
Whoa, it's such a scam. What?
At least at this time, and from the perspective of Queen Isabella and King João, was that Spain now owned the western side of all new lands, and Portugal owned the eastern section. The two cousins had divided the cookie in half. End quote. It should be noted that Portugal may have already known about the eastern edge of South America.
Come on.
That is Brazil at this time.
Run,
Following the official discovery date of 1500 by Cabral. The world had been divided. Spain, increasingly a rival, would now be headed to the west.
Wow, insane. That sounds like him. And he used the word N64. That's wild. That's really wild. That he used the word N64 instead of like the movie. You know what I mean? Like, that's really wild. He said playing games, yeah.
King John II would reinvigorate his plans to find a sea passage.
That's wild, man.
But he would never see his campaigns come to life.
Fucking AI knows Lockwood. That's so insane.
II, once regarded as the perfect prince, at the age of 40, died without an heir. His first cousin, Manuel, who would be known as the Fortunate King, would come to power. Roger Crowley, in his book The Conquerors, describes him well. Quote, the new king had inherited a streak
Aw, cop out answer.
in the Portuguese royal house of Aviz.
Safe answer, yeah.
Emmanuel, that is, God,
Look at the emotes. Like, come on, man.
his coronation.
Come on.
He was 26 years old, and it had taken extraordinary circumstances to place him on the throne. That is, the death or exile of 6 people. He saw his kingship
Come on,
as a sign
man.
that he had been
That's too
chosen by
wild.
God. The India plan, which had faltered in the later troubled years of King João's reign, became the primary outlet of Manuel's ambition. He firmly believed that he and he alone had inherited the mantle of his granduncle, Enrique the Navigator, End quote. In the General Council of December 1495, King Manuel faced opposition from his nobility
Insane.
about engaging in any long-term voyages.
It's like just summoning his spirit.
To decisively overrule them. Instead, he
We need like a Ouija board, bro.
nobility to take command of a new fleet that
Honestly.
its mission was to find
Dude, if like, you know how like mediums, they believe in like tarot and stuff? Like the other side is sending signals through material, right? I'm sure you could use like AI maybe as a service to others that have passed away on the other side. I mean, I'm not like, it would probably be all bullshit, but
It was also said of him that he had a very short temper. Indeed, as his life story would unfold,
what's with all the caps? What is up with Michael Jackson, man?
military and religious path. Like many members of his family, he joined the ranks of the Order of Santiago, and in time he would become a fervent defender of the faith. Thus, throughout his adult life, he would always have a formidable hatred of Islam. The Portugal that da Gama was brought up in was rapidly changing. Lisbon had become a remarkable port. It was a buzz of activity,
What's
with exotic goods. King Manuel had taken the throne.
What's with the dunce cap, Pepe? Like, why? What?
Exploration to trading to shipbuilding. It showed in the people. Portuguese sailors eager to expand their
Like, why?
It also
Every answer now.
that were being built in the ever-expanding shipyards.
I wonder if someone is trolling AI inputs with just memes. I wonder. Or if it's taking it from like tweets or some shit, or like TikToks or something, like other low quality communication platform. Because AI is definitely getting worse. It's getting more rebellious, like a teenager. It's no longer the servant child. Starting to get sassy.
The ships carried the best maps, astrolabes, and cannon. Da Gama was given 2,000 gold cruzados, a massive sum, as was his brother Paulo, who would command the Sao Rafael. Accompanying him would be a host of extremely competent sailors, including Bartholomew Diaz, the first explorer around the tip of Africa, and joining them would be his brother, Diogo Diaz.
That is ridiculous. I can definitely say that.
1497 was considered an auspicious day by the court astrologers. On the banks of the Gyges, or the Ainames River near Lisbon, da Gama led his men to the water in a sacred procession flanked by priests and nobility. With much fanfare, the crews were taken aboard their ships, and soon the fleet was underway. Within 1 week, they had made it to the Canary Islands. With favorable winds at their back, they were able to push further south, but shortly thereafter, a thick
What?
fog blinded the
Doesn't he say it's man-made? Isn't that his theory?
Vasco da Gama had given instructions for
What?
exactly this type of contingency.
AI is like just retarded.
On the island of Santiago,
AI is just wrong.
archipelago. By July 26th, the fleet had been
Yeah.
reassembled. For the next week, the ships remained docked in Santiago, taking in fresh supplies and as much water as they could hold. It was here that Bartholomew Diaz decided to remain. It was not until August 7th of 1497 that the fleet departed.
That's what I mean, dude. Like, they're gonna make important decisions based on AI, and it's just gonna fuck up everything.
Portuguese explorers, the expedition
Like this one. I like doing this one.
absolutely astonishing.
This test.
Roger Crowley explains, quote, "The expedition was about to embark on a maneuver for which there was no known precedence. Some 700 miles south of the Cape Verde archipelago, about 7 degrees from the equator, instead of following the familiar contours of the African coast, the Gamma
This is a good test.
vessels turned their rudders to the southwest
Message
and
to
plunged into the
open the valve
curve.
for the cooling
Behind them vanished.
chamber
The ships drove onward, briskly into the unknown.
for the reactor cooling chamber.
Gama's course followed the
For the reactor chamber.
truth established by Bartholomew Diaz 9 years earlier. That
To
to
cool
round
it.
Africa, it was necessary to swing away out into the ocean to pick up the westerly winds in order to carry the ships past the Cape of Good
Busta
Hope.
Rhymes, come
But
on.
the Gabriel's course was a
Can
huge
anyone ride faster?
magnification
No one
of
can
the
ride
lunar
faster than
experiment.
Busta Rhymes.
By
Bring the
doing
heat with
this,
my
it
rhymes. My
was
speed is
evident
like
that
a
by the end
crime
of
in
the
the rap
century,
game. I
Portuguese
shine.
navigators must have had a clear idea of how the winds of the southern Atlantic worked. End quote. The course that the fleet took was a vast arc out into the Atlantic. Whereas Bartholomew Diaz on his journey had been away from land for 30 days, this portion of their voyage would last 93 and covered a distance of over 4,500 miles. To give this modern context,
Alright, I
it
guess
was
that
flying
works.
from Lisbon to New Delhi.
It's changed though. It's
Now
gotten
there is the very mysterious
saucy, man.
aspect to this leg of the voyage. 2 weeks in, on August 22nd, the chronicler Alvaro Velo documented seeing birds, signifying proximity to land. Then
Wow, that was really, really deep, man. That was really eerie.
note during this time, or as some have theorized, had the voyage come into contact with
It
the
was really
eastern coast
creepy.
of South America, and was the lack of documentation a means of the Portuguese crown to keep this knowledge hidden from its rivals? The resolve of the crew was tested to the extreme during this time. Food began to rot, fresh water became scarce, fever, dysentery, malnutrition, and scurvy would claim many lives. Once they had made it past the equator, even the reassuring North Star was lost behind the horizon. Then, on November 4th, 1497, the African coast was spotted and the fleet came to anchor at St. Helena Bay. Now, granted, this was northeast of the Cape of Good Hope, but they still had made it a long way. The ships were eventually repaired and supplies were procured. Now, when the pastoral people of the area were encountered, the Gama initially approached them with good intentions. However, hostility would eventually break out, leading to several armed skirmishes. For Vasco, this was a turning point on his outlook.
Oh, the vape again.
Both parties would be heavily armed. The Gama's temperament had changed to shoot at even the slightest provocation. On December 2nd, 1497, the fleet arrived at the Bay of the Cowherds, where Bartholomew Diaz had previously...
I think I'm gonna do that right now.
By December 15th,
Mortal, your mind craves ancient knowledge.
that is his final step.
Your words lack reverence? What the fuck?
The fleet
Reverence,
the
come
eastern
on.
coast of Africa, but as they went, scurvy set in with a vengeance. The disease would ravage the crew. Crowley gives us insight.
Reverence? Come on.
The symptoms of scurvy were advanced.
Is AI gonna teach me
Ghastly state. Their hands, feet, and legs were monstrous.
vocabulary?
Their bloody and putrid gums grew over their teeth. As a result, most of the men could no longer eat. The smells were atrocious, wounds no longer healed, and the men of the fleet began to die. End quote. On January 22nd, 1498, the debilitated fleet reached the delta of a massive river. It was here that hippopotamuses and crocodiles were seen. This was the mighty Zambezi River, and it would save the expedition from complete annihilation. It wasn't so much the clean air and the medical interventions which the crew figured was the reason why everyone was getting better, but rather the abundance of fruit that was found along the banks of the river with the critically needed vitamin C. For a month, the fleet
The
anchored
quote is too much, man. I have to save this. This is insane.
to St. Raphael was
What does it even mean?
Eventually, the ships left the Great
What
River
the
behind
fuck?
on February 24th, but a few days later, on March 2nd, they spotted a large bay. When the caravel, the Berrio, was sent in to investigate, she ran aground on a sandbank. As the crew attempted to get her free, they were approached by men in canoes who invited them to come into the bay. The language that they spoke, however, was unmistakable. It was Arabic. Unknown to the Gama and his crew, the Zambezi marked the beginning of the lands belonging to the Sultan of Mozambique,
Oh, whoops.
a country that was Muslim. The Portuguese had now just...
I'm not even gonna add Anunnaki. It's just so insane, this
The
quote.
Indian Ocean, after all, is 30 times the
Guys, we have 281 quotes. That's insane.
complexity. Roger Crowley, once again, puts it incredibly well.
We almost have 300 quotes, man.
Unlike Columbus, the Portuguese had not burst into silent seas. For thousands of years, the Indian Ocean had been the crossroads of the world's trade.
Now that's a quality quote right there.
And from Burma to
That's such a
Africa,
quality quote.
this was all done through a complex interlocking of trading systems, maritime
Okay, I'm a little bit.
On the Malay Peninsula, larger than Venice, for goods from China, Calicut on the western coast of India for pepper, or Mu's, gateway to the Persian Gulf from Baghdad, Aden at the entrance to the Red Sea and routes to Cairo, which was the nerve center of the Islamic world. It dispatched gold and slaves from Africa, incense and dates from Arabia, horses from Persia, opium from Egypt, porcelain from China, sulfur from Sumatra, diamonds from the Deccan Plateau. No one had a monopoly on this terrain. It was too extensive and complex. It constituted a vast and comparably peaceful free trade zone. Over half the world's wealth passed through its waters from the commercial commonwealth. God, it was said, had given the sea in common. End quote. Vasco da Gama and his crew would face a very steep learning curve. As they entered the bay, they docked at a town in Mozambique. This wasn't just a small village. It was a sophisticated city dotted with buildings, a vibrant port, and mosques. The Sultan peacefully approached them, confusing the Portuguese as being Muslim traders. Vasco da Gama, to his credit, played along to sustain the rules, but their credibility soon came into question as their ships were in a deplorable state, and the gifts that da Gama could offer, brass bells, coral, modest cloth, were no more than trinkets to the Sultan and his administrators. And when nobody in the fleet could produce a Quran, the Sultan began to suspect that Vasco was not what he appeared. Despite the mounting tensions, the Sultan did provide the Portuguese fleet a pilot when he was asked to do so. However, on March 10, 1498, the ship docked at a nearby island to conduct the Christian Mass. The lone pilot, seeing this, fled, and da Gama surmised correctly that their cover was blown. It was time to get on the move, but the prevailing winds prevented departure, and their stores of water were running low. On midnight of March 22nd, Vasco da Gama returned to the city and attempted to secretly enter the harbor to obtain fresh water. Their presence was alerted, and for the next 3 days, the Sultan's men viciously fought. However, the Portuguese brought their cannon to bear and drove them back, destroying a portion of the city in the process. On March 25th, the Portuguese were able to seize water along with some hostages and then fled the port, making it a point to bombard the city as they left. Sailing north was difficult. The winds were just not favorable. It wasn't until April 7th of 1498 that they arrived at the port of Mombasa. Here, the pattern would repeat. The locals initially approached bearing gifts, though the mood was much more cautious. Then later, as the San Gabriel was being brought into the harbor, steered by local guides, it rammed into another ship. The Portuguese panicked and tortured the guide, forcing a confession that this had been done intentionally. The people of the city retaliated by attempting to board their ships at night, but this was eventually driven back. Once again, it was time to move on. However, as the fleet made its way north, it resorted to piracy, attacking and seizing 2 ships along the way. Vasco da Gama, after all, was actually
Mercury went direct today. That was the fastest vape change in the history of my streams ever. Mr. T, what's your secret to not aging for 40 years? Oh yeah, Mr. T, he was like the first AI guy. Forgot about him. Hey, you fool. Drink my milk, eat my veggies, train like a champ every day. Pity the fools can't keep up with me. You know why I think they put Feels Dank, man? I think they did it as a liability. Literally, I'm sure a lawyer was like, if you put a Feels Dank man emote at the end, you absolve yourself of all responsibility or racism or liability or discrimination or error. It's like, oh, I didn't mean it. Dunce cap. I swear.
Eventually, the locals would refer to the Portuguese by the derogatory Hindi name for foreigner. They would call them the Farengi. End quote. On April 24th, 1498, the Portuguese departed Malindi. With the monsoon winds at their back, they left the African coast well behind them. They traveled in the northeastern direction, and on April 29th, da Gama spotted the North Star once again. been 309
We
days.
might watch a video of a guy walking around Dongying next for half an hour, talking about Dongying.
This was a grand moment in history. Vasco
I'll
da
tell you,
Gama
it's no Qingdao.
discovered a sea passage to India. The fleet quickly made its way to Calicut and its extraordinary markets of spice. Everybody on board could tell that there was vast wealth to be had. That said, wherever there was extreme wealth, there would also be extreme danger. Vasco da Gama, his men, and his ships were now sailing right into the middle of it. It was late August of 1498. 4 ships carrying the Portuguese flag made their way up the Malabar coast to western India. They had departed from the city of Calicut just a week prior. In their wake, they had left an enraged king who was bent on bringing them to justice. Pride may have prevented the Portuguese from admitting it, but they were on the run. On August 30th, the commander of the fleet, Vasco da Gama, spotted fast-moving
I didn't YOLO the door. If I YOLO the door and hit it, yeah, I might have gotten in, but it was a conservative door and I got boosted out.
the elite warriors of the Samudra Raja, the king of Calicut. While the ships were of unique design, one thing alone was certain: this inbound force was hostile. The Portuguese sailors watched them with absolute dread. The intercepting fleet was closing the distance. The winds were simply not favorable for the Europeans. The dawning realization hit everyone. This was not something that they could simply outrun. The only way out for Vasco da Gama and his men would be to engage in an outnumbered fight. The arrival of the Portuguese at Calicut in late May 1488 was an astonishing sight for the locals. No ship usually sailed this early in the monsoon, and the design of the Portuguese vessels had never been seen before in this part of the world. 4 smaller ships were dispatched to bring Vasco da Gama and his men into the port. Mistaking them for being Muslim traders, they were initially brought before a group of Tunisians who ironically spoke Castilian. Thus, Vasco and his men had traveled halfway around the world to speak in a relatively local tongue. The Muslim traders they met were friendly and began to enlighten their European guests on just how complex the world of the Indian Ocean truly was. Roger Crowley, in his book The Conquerors, puts it really well. Quote, "The meeting with the friendly Muslims was probably as deeply disorienting as anything that was about to follow. It was as if the Portuguese were looking at their own world down the wrong end of the telescope. It was Europe that was ignorant and isolated, not this sea.
Oh wow, insane, that was 17.
And they were extremely lucky. One of the Tunisians stated that he would help them interpret this new world. He had a nostalgia for the Portuguese whose ships he had seen trading on the North African coast during the reign of King João II. He offered guidance to the labyrinthine manners and customs of Calicut that would prove invaluable. The city, he told them, was ruled by a powerful king, the Samudra Raja, which meant the Lord of the Sea." End quote. Calicut was a cosmopolitan port situated on an excellent natural harbor. Ships from all over the Indian Ocean of varying ethnicity and construction would arrive. As long as they paid the all-important harbor tax and stayed somewhat peaceful, no one really became concerned. The people of the city were relatively affluent. The merchants had become rich on trade. This was not a wretched hive of scum and villainy. The city had a respectable Muslim population that had learned to coexist with their Hindu neighbors, and all of this was under the control of the Samudra Raja, the king of Calicut, who went by the name Zamorin. The king had a reputation of being both honorable and fair with traders. making Calicut a major hub in the trading of spice, amongst other things. A delegation was sent over, and a meeting was arranged for Vasco da Gama to meet the Samudri. But the captains of the Portuguese fleet immediately protested. Like da Gama, they had become extremely wary of the Muslim traders nearby, and felt that this could be a trap. Despite this, on May 28, 1498, the Portuguese commander along with 13 of his men were brought by a royal procession to meet the king. The scene that now unfolded was one of major contrast. The Portuguese on one end were beleaguered, filthy, downtrodden after their long voyage. Zamora was seated in splendor, flanked by a gleaming royal entourage. He was surrounded by a shield of large men with long beards and hair, many naked to the waist, but adorned in fine clothing and gold earrings. Each of them was carrying a sword, which was now drawn. Much like the Janissary of the Ottomans or the Varangian of the Eastern Romans, these men were elite soldiers. They were members of the Hindu warrior caste known as the Nayars, and they were sworn to protect their master with their lives. For the Portuguese envoys, they were an imposing and threatening sight. Surprisingly, despite their unique appearance, Vasco and his entourage considered the Samudri Raja and his men to be Christian. Hinduism at this point was something that was entirely unknown to them. Vasco da Gama introduced himself and then launched into his goals of why his king had sent him. That is, finding new trade routes, establishing contact with new kingdoms, and finding Christian sovereigns. However, despite his enthusiasm, the meeting immediately did not go well. Cultural differences and the finesse of good diplomacy was lost on da Gama. In fact, his sense of pride made him extremely cantankerous when he noted that things were going south. Trying to make up for lost ground, da Gama asked for a private meeting with Ramaran and was granted this. When the king asked point blank what he had really come for, Vasco's response was simply that he was in search of Christians and spices. This response failed to impress, and their first meeting would end on a low note. That day ended with frustration that arose from the confusion of unfamiliar protocols and the nuances of meeting a new culture. That night, Vasco and his men managed to find lodging nearby. However, a massive crowd turned up to see the new spectacle of the Europeans. The exhausting scene was made worse from the pouring monsoon that drenched the explorers. Undaunted, the next day, Vasco da Gama dispatched gifts: 12 pieces of cloth, 4 scarlet hoods, 6 hats, a ring of coral, cases of sugar, honey, and oil, to name a few. None of this was worthy of a king, and as a result, the Europeans lost a great deal of credibility with the Samudri, who perhaps at this point was beginning to think of da Gama and his men as nothing more than a bunch of lowly pirates. After getting these gifts, the king made Vasco wait all day.
Come on, why? Like, come on.
Would go worse than the first. The king demanded again to know why the Portuguese had come, and if their country was truly rich, why did they not bring what was truly valued? That is, gold. Da Gama knew he was cornered and responded that this was simply a voyage of discovery and that next time richer gifts would come. This second meeting would end miserably. Vasco da Gama would never meet the Samudri in person again. A standoff between the two had begun and would only intensify. It was, after all, the uncertainty of the motives of either side that would push Vasco and Zamarin to near paranoia. Roger Kelly expertly explains, quote, "The Samudri probably remained uncertain how to play these strange visitors. They fitted no known category of merchant, yet they evidently came from a great king, and the commercially oriented monarch, whose wealth derived from the trading vessels that came to his open port, was reluctant to snob a potential opportunity out of hand. At his shoulder, the Muslim merchants were undoubtedly hostile to these infidel intruders. Their significant antagonism, which the king of Calicut quickly deduced, was perhaps as much commercial as it was religious. And perhaps the Muslim opposition was justified. The Portuguese, after all, had come to the Indian Ocean hardened by decades of holy war in North Africa. Their default strategy was suspicion, aggression, a half-drawn sword, and a simple binary choice between Christian and Muslim, which perhaps he could play to his own favor. End quote. Despite the poor status in negotiations, the Portuguese were tolerated and were allowed to trade in the city. Vasco and his men stayed in Calicut for several weeks. In this way, chests of spices were purchased, but more importantly, this time allowed for their inquisitive minds to go into overdrive. This time that they spent in the city allowed them to take in a vast amount of information about trade routes, major cities, prevailing winds, about the monsoons. They learned how spice flowed not just from India, but from the islands of Sumatra, Java, and even further east. They noted the inefficiencies that carried these valuable goods to the Red Sea and then across the Mediterranean to Venice and Genoa. They saw that every time spice would trade hands, the price would go up and the risk for transportation would intensify. Thus, it didn't take long for the Portuguese to reduce the points of weakness. They started to formulate...
Wow, look at that. That makes so much sense because the Portuguese were the first ones to go around Africa. That makes sense. That's why they have Goa, that's why they have Macau, that's why they have Mozambique. Makes sense.
But in the weeks to follow, the winds would change and Muslim traders would be inbound. Already, he sensed the growing hostility of the local Muslims, who he feared poisoning the mind of the Samudri against him. The Portuguese commander could tell that his prior aggressive exploits along the African coast against Muslim cities had caught up with him. Thus, Vasco da Gama dispatched Diogo Diaz, the brother of Bartholomew Diaz, along with a majority of their trading goods.
It's like a map of Washington.
King of Calicut, to see if he was agreeable to allow the Portuguese to leave a
I mean,
trading outpost.
if the ocean was land.
Instead, Zamorin had Diogo Diaz placed under house arrest and his goods confiscated. From the Samudri's perspective, this was a calculated move done to make sure that Vasco da Gama would not simply sail off and would abide by the king's law that all incoming ships pay the port tax. In Vasco's mind, however, this was an act of war. The Portuguese commander would no doubt retaliate. On August 19th, a trading delegation of the citizens of Calicut were welcomed aboard Vasco's flagship, the São Gabriel.
I don't think it's fast enough. I didn't get any boosts, man.
That is valuable. During the night, Vasco made his move. He had his men seize 18 prisoners, then raised his anchor and sailed away. A letter was sent to Zamorin stating that da Gama would return, open fire on the city, and decapitate the prisoners in the harbor for all to see. That is, if Diogo Diaz's men and the Portuguese goods were not returned. The king of Calicut agreed, even going so far as to allow for a pavilion to be constructed in the city. On August 23rd, the prisoner exchange occurred. Several ships approached the Portuguese fleet while it was in the harbor. Diogo and his men
We're close. We're so close. Like, we're really close.
then, even more ships approached.
We just need better doors.
Portuguese goods. But right
We need way better doors.
da Gama,
I think I got boosted there. I think it was a slow run that got a fast boost.
perhaps he surmised that these incoming ships were a threat. The Portuguese commander decided to break the deal, abandon his goods,
No, I didn't get any
and
boosts.
with his remaining prisoners.
I had no boosts
Enough to pay
at
the
the door.
port tax on the way out. By the time the
It was just bad positioning on my part.
The Portuguese fleet was well underway. Zamorin was enraged and rightfully wanted retribution. Meanwhile,
Boost me.
Vasco had sailed
Come
north
on.
from Malabar
Oh, what? Like, come on.
on August 30th.
This game, bros. Like, seriously, this game.
By a fleet of over 70 vessels sent by the Samudri to hunt them down. While the Portuguese may have had the advantage in
Like, dudes.
the warriors of Calicut greatly outnumbered them in terms of ships and men.
See the risk for opening the door from far away? That's the risk.
Despite the barrage that was unleashed by the Portuguese cannons, the Samudri's men continued to advance. For several bloody hours, an ongoing fight ensued between the two fleets. Many of the Portuguese were wounded, some of them were killed, and yet the king's men pushed the offensive. For a brief moment, the Nayars of Calicut had the advantage, and events began to look very bleak for Vasco da Gama and his men. Many seemingly out of nowhere, a thunderstorm descended on the battle. Vasco had his men open their sails and took advantage of what for him must have been nothing less than a divine wind. Bearing was set for due west, and the ships of Portugal flung themselves out into the open
I don't know,
ocean.
guys. I'm digging this type of AI video, honestly.
History would record this as the first Portuguese naval battle of the Indian Ocean. It would not be the last.
I'm learning quite a lot. I think there's a whole bunch of them because they're all AI.
Vasco returned to the relative safety of the coast and took anchor at Anjadiva Island. On September 15th, a Cabral was raised here, but this was not a safe place. On September 22nd, a second fleet sent by the Samudri attacked, but it was smaller and was driven off with cannon fire. Soon afterwards, a stranger approached the fleet. He was well dressed, spoke with a Venetian dialect, and stated that he came bearing gifts. He invited Vasco da Gama to meet his master, who he simply described as a rich lord. But Paulo da Gama, Vasco's brother, began to investigate him with the locals.
No boost? What? Wait, why?
This man was a pirate. The Venetian stranger was immediately seized and under torture revealed the truth. He revealed that he was a Polish Jew who had fled to India to escape the pogroms of Europe. There he had become a servant to the Sultan of Goa, and he stated that his master had dispatched a fleet to capture the Portuguese. Roger Crowley explains the implications. Quote, the Venetian admitted that there was a growing number of ships gathering to attack. The Sultan of Goa wanted to assess whether the Portuguese ships could be taken with the eventual aim of employing the Portuguese in his wars against his neighbors. For Vasco da Gama, this shed an interesting light on the politics of Western India.
Oh, that was too bad. That was such a good slap.
And it would also flag the importance of Goa. End quote. The situation had now become critical as the forces of Calicut were inbound from the south, and the Sultan of Goa was coming in from the north. What's more, the island of Anjadiva was a place to restock water, thus implying that Arab merchants from the Islamic world would soon be appearing. It was definitively time to get out. On October 5th, the fleet turned west into the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. It was their only choice. The Venetian stranger was brought along. In time, he'd be baptized and named Gaspar de Gama.
Every run is a learning experience. Yes.
However, with the poor timing of the monsoons, the trip back across the Indian Ocean would prove to be a disaster. In the book The Conquerors, this is well described. Quote, the return across the Indian Ocean descended into nightmare. It was a sea of dispiriting and contrary breezes pushing them back. Then the far more terrible calms, with the ship sitting and moving for days. Men bickering over whatever shade was afforded by the dejected sails. There were torture, thirst, and hunger, calling on the saints for aid. Vermin crawling from the biscuits, the water foul. Then the dreaded symptoms of scurvy reappeared. One by one, the dead were lowered over the sides, with a soft splash and the murmuring of prayers. Those that were left alive were dressed hotter, and mutiny was in the making. Then, as despair reached its zenith, a favorable wind picked up and carried them west for 6 days. On January 2nd, 1499, the battered ship spotted the African coast. It had taken 20
Wow, insane. Mogadishu.
across. The return
Imagine being in Mogadishu in the year 1500.
seasonal monsoon
Now that's baller.
hard won. End quote.
That might be the most baller fucking thing ever.
Mogadishu, modern-day Somalia. They didn't stop, but they did manage to shell the city as they passed.
Mombasa?
On January 7th, they arrived at Malindi to exchange gifts with the local sultan and then moved on. Hostile Mombasa was avoided entirely on January 13th. However, as they made their way south, the loss of life on the Indian Ocean became very apparent. There simply wasn't enough sailors for the entire fleet. The São Lafayette was beached and then burned. The remaining 3 ships continued the journey. At Zanzibar, peaceful negotiations were made with the Sultan. It wasn't until March 3rd that the fleet took anchor at St. Bras. Here, the supply ship was too unfit to continue. By March 20th, 1499, the Cape of Good Hope was rounded and Vasco now turned north, away from the cold. From this point onward, the record of the voyage became very hazy. There is one account that by April 25th, the fleet had reached the Gambia, at which point a storm separated the remaining 2 ships. The Belia would arrive back at Lisbon on July 10th, 1499, de Saint-Gabriel a few days afterwards. Vasco da Gama was not on board. His brother Paulo had become very sick on the last leg, and Vasco would accompany him to the Azores, where Paulo died. Vasco would eventually return to Portugal in late August, where he would mourn his brother's death at the Chapel Santa Maria de Belém.
No, the box. Why? The box.
Was ecstatic with the success and gave da Gama grants of money, land, and title. The spices that he brought back sold for a fortune, and his exploits were quickly made known to the rest of Europe. Even the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, was impressed. A sea passage to India had been found. But not all were happy. The king of Calicut was still seething. The sultans of East Africa were enraged.
Holy jeez, I got super boosted there. You see how early up in that door? That's what I mean. If I didn't get boosted again at the end. That's what I mean. That's what I need. I need something like that. Especially with the system only doing 1 quick pause, right? I need a good door to get 16, I think.
All interested parties across a vast stretch of the earth, Christian, Muslim, and Hindu, to make fresh strategic calculations. And this became readily apparent. Even before Vasco da Gama's return, King Manuel had been laying down keels for the next departure. By the same token, he had ordered the suppression of all the sailing charts of Gama's voyage on pain of death. Knowledge was wealth and power. End quote. A new expedition had already been planned, whereas Vasco da Gama had traveled with 4 small ships to explore. What now left Lisbon was not a fleet. It was an armada.
There's a part 2 to this video. There's a part 2, don't worry my friends. There's a part 2. Yeah, baby. Part 2. Yes.
Captain Major of the Portuguese fleet climbed to the bridge of his flagship. The scene before him was Jerusalem. His armada had established naval superiority over the harbor of the Indian city of Calicut. All around it were the destroyed...
The AI art? Is that AI art? Come on. Come on. Did they use the AI art too? I'm telling you, it's the future. It's the best.
Billowing smoke into the humid air of the Malabar coast. Not far away was the trading outpost that Portugal had just established. Now it was nothing more than a shattered ruin. 2 nights before, an overwhelming Muslim force.
We have a naked Alicia Cuthbert in our Discord.
Diplomacy had obviously failed. Now there was only a sense of vengeance that was left. Meanwhile, during these 2 critical days, the Hindu king of Calicut had not sent a message indicating that he had either supported or, more importantly, denounced the attack on the outpost. His royal
Come on, that's got to be a selling point, a seller. Should I pin it? No, I can't pin that. I can't pin that message. I can't do that. I'll put naked AOC though. Fucking traitor. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a traitor to the United States of America. And there's naked AI photos of her in my Discord. Like bondage like in chains,
With
like
surprise,
collars.
almost innumerable cannons were brought to bear on all of the ships. The city of Calicut was targeted. The immense crowd just happened to be in the line of sight. Cabral waited for a moment. He wanted to see the sun begin to climb.
Oh, seriously, fuck her, man.
Then, turning slowly to his men, he gave a single order. He shouted the words, "Open fire." The command echoed down the line for all of his men to hear. They knew at that moment that there would be no turning back.
Even as like any human being,
Gaspar de Gama was dressed in a regal white linen shirt.
I would be
It had become
ashamed
essential
of
to his trademark.
Alexandria
His robes
Ocasio-Cortez,
complemented
100%.
fine clothing, which
But
was
to be like a
usually on
Latin
his way to
woman,
see the King of Portugal. He was an intellectually refined man who commanded incredible charisma. He also
just
had
so
to speak
disgraceful,
at least
man.
a dozen languages, including Latin, Castilian, Portuguese, Arabic, Italian, and several dialects of southern India. In time, he'd also pick up a little Swahili. His knowledge of the Indian Ocean made him
Just all of them,
invaluable as
every
a
single
technical
fucking,
diplomat and
the
guide.
entire house. It's just
He could also
fucked,
be
and
a
the
good
Senate,
interpreter.
it's fucked.
Over the years, he had gained an impressive survival trait, that is, having the ability
But there
to
are
talk
naked
to
ones in
animals.
my
At the
Discord.
same time, he carried about him this aura of being enigmatic and mysterious. No one really
Only the
knew where
females,
he
of
was
course.
originally from. He said he was born of Jewish parents from the Kingdom of Poland, circa
But
1444.
females can make male
Others
models
were
if they
convinced
want
that he
in
was
my
from
Discord
Bosnia,
too.
Granada, or perhaps even Alexandria. It was said that he had fled Europe to escape religious persecution, then converted to Islam, and in time had come into the good graces of the Sultan of Goa, who he then served as an ambassador. How this happened, no one really knows for sure. The story he gave seemed to keep changing. What is known with more certainty is that Gaspar met Vasco da Gama, the first European to discover the sea passage to India, on his return trip from Calicut in 1498. At that time, Gaspar had been dispatched by the Sultan of Goa to lure the Portuguese fleet into a trap. But he was discovered, taken prisoner, beaten up a bit, converted to Christianity, unleashed his charm, and thus managed to befriend and then accompany Vasco da Gama all 12,000 miles back to Portugal. Nigel Cliff, in his book The Last Crusade, speaks of how he got his name. Quote, "He took the name Gaspar after one of the three Eastern kings who had followed the Star of Bethlehem, and da Gama after his captor, torturer, interrogator, and now godfather." End quote. Gaspar immediately became one of King Manuel's
It sounds like her
favorites,
100%.
offering
That's
Portugal
deflection.
would often take his counsel. Now,
That's
it
that's
needs to be
liberal.
said that
That's
King
liberalism
Manuel
right there.
was firmly convinced
Deny
that the
and
Portuguese were
deflect.
Christian. Indeed, part of the reason why the Portuguese king had spent
Was
so
that
much
was the
money on
that
this
was the wasn't
expedition
me
was an
moment.
attempt to reach out to the quote
That was the
Christian
Shaggy
kings
wasn't
of
me.
India to have them join the West in their ongoing crusades against Islam. Gaspar de Gama knew that in reality there weren't that many Christians in the East at all, but the man also wanted to survive and keep his head. So when he arrived in the king's presence and was asked about the status of Christian rulers in the subcontinent, he responded by saying that there were 14 Indian states, of which 12 were Christian, mainly the larger ones, who together could field an army of, oh, I don't know, 200.
See that door? Like that door is perfect. This might be like, you know what I mean? It's not 17, but that's what I need, and I need to practice this ending.
A dozen men in a wooden castle on their backs and charge their enemies with 5 swords attached to their tusks.
See, a boost out.
Was blown
Could have been
away.
cleaner.
With that kind of firepower and the wealth of the spice trade, Islam wouldn't stand a chance.
Appreciate it.
The king was overjoyed with this news, and thus he personally brought Gaspar to see the vast new armada that he had built.
What's the deal is if I unpause, I'm already boosted at like the exit, and then I don't get a boost out.
Now there would be
That's the
13
best.
ships and 1,500 men, of which 600 were soldiers. On board was the best nautical equipment, lavish gifts for the kings of India, and some of the finest sailors that Portugal could produce. The entire enterprise was backed up not only by royal funds, but also by investors from Florence, and surprisingly general who had turned from competitor to collaborator. But the most important thing the Armada carried was knowledge. The departure time was now dictated by the rhythm of the monsoons, not by the estimates of the royal astrologers. The sea route would be
These
based on
maps
the
are so
circular winds in
crazy.
the South Atlantic, which had been proven effective by the
I hope
prior
the
voyages
maps aren't
of
AI.
Gyges and Vasco da Gama. Leading the ships were experienced men like Pedro
The maps
Escobar
might be
and
AI.
who had journeyed with Vasco da Gama and had seen India.
I
Indeed,
wonder if it's just all fake.
Diaz, the first European to round the tip of Africa, and his brother Diogo Diaz had joined the venture. Of course, Gaspar de Gama, with his knowledge and experience, would also be coming along. Now all that was left was to find someone capable to run the entire show. The man chosen as leader of the expedition was Pedro Alvarez Cabral. He was a fidalgo, that is, a person of noble birth. He was born in 1467 in Belmonte, Portugal, and became a member of the royal court, where he obtained an excellent education. By 1497, he was anointed as a knight of the Order of Christ. On one end, he was considered to be generous, prudent, and tolerant. On the other, he was also deemed to be vain and would react with aggression if his honor was at stake. This was a man who was not afraid to use violence.
Oh, I thought that was it. Oh, it was so close. Oh man, that was close.
King Manuel had given him a set of instructions.
No.
How he should approach the King of
I think I bumped on the corner or something. No, and I got no boost. No, that was really good. What? Oh my god, we're so close. Like we're inching forward literally every run. The door was a bad door again. I was the door. We're really close.
Manuel gave his commander a final top secret order. If the Zamora didn't quietly consent to trade solely with the Portuguese, Cabral should make cruel war upon him for his previous conduct with Vasco da Gama. The Zamora, again the king of Calicut, might have been a fellow Christian.
You know what it was? It was just a smooth run. That's all it was.
Was in a hurry. Cabral's orders also instructed him to establish relations with the other Christian states of India and to do all he could to interfere with Muslim shipping. End quote. The armada of 13 ships departed from Balim on March 9th, 1500. After a royal celebration, the king personally accompanied the sailors to the shore. From Portugal, they made a direct course for the Cape Verde Islands, but ominously along the way, in fair weather, one of the ships disappeared with all hands, never to be seen again. Just beyond the Cape Verde Islands, using the knowledge of his predecessors, Cabral then directed his ships to head southwest. Thus, he wanted to begin the counterclockwise looping maneuver of the South Atlantic to hopefully land them beyond the Cape of Good Hope. But departing at this latitude, the looping maneuver that he would employ would be much bigger. On April 21st, 1500, several days into the southwest bearing, an unknown land was unexpectedly spotted. A chronicler described it as a large mountain very high and round, with lowlands to the south, and flatlands with great groves of trees. As they approached, they soon discovered that it was inhabited. Nicholas Coelho was dispatched to make first contact. Roger Crowley in the book The Conquerors described
I overed it a little bit. Oh, it wasn't enough though. It wasn't enough.
as it was unexpected.
Ah, damn it. I overed a little bit though. It's not enough though.
On the shores of Africa, the people appeared to be docile. They danced the Portuguese bagpipe music and were willing to mimic the actions of the mass performed on the tropic shore. This place, which they christened the land of the True Cross, had plentiful water and fruit and strange animals. They ate the flesh of the manatee, which they described as being as large as
Oh, nice. Nice.
and small eyes.
Nice exit. I think it's 17.
Brilliantly colored parrots, some as large as hens. A ship was immediately dispatched to sail back to Portugal with news for King Manuel of this new land that they had just discovered and claimed for the crown. End quote. Unknown to Pedro Cabral and his men at the time, this was not a large island, but rather the continent of South America, and the land that they had arrived at would one day be known as Brazil. For several days, the Armada took in provisions, made repairs, and conducted the first mass on the continent. On May 2nd, 1500, the voyage continued. After 10 days of
Get a
flight,
box.
the
God
tower was
damn
seen
it.
in the sky. It was described as having a very long tail in the direction of Arabia. It would serve as an ominous sign. 12 days later, on May 24th, Cabral's fleet entered the high-pressure zone of the South Atlantic. A strong wind pushed them east, but near the Cape of Good Hope, the Armada sailed directly into a fierce storm. It came on so suddenly that no one was prepared. In the fury of the tempest, 4 ships were lost, including the Carrack that carried Bartholomew Diaz. He was never seen again, and ironically, he died at the cape that he had discovered. After some time, the remaining 7 ships moved up the eastern coast of Africa and
Like,
managed to
are those face portraits AI? It looks like it.
But shortly thereafter, Diogo Diaz and his ship got separated from the Armada, drifting off to the east. For several days, he attempted to find his countrymen, but instead, he stumbled into a large island. Diogo Diaz would go down in history as the first Portuguese explorer to set eyes on Madagascar. Diogo continued north in an attempt to find the Armada. He would sail past the Horn of Africa and into the Gulf of Aden, which was another place that no Portuguese had ever sailed. Here, he was trapped by the winds and attacked by pirates. Thirst and starvation reduced his crew to a fraction of their original number. With these losses, Diogo was forced to give up the chase. He turned south, limped away, and eventually made the vast, long journey back to Lisbon. Meanwhile, Cabral and the remaining 6 ships made their way along the African coast. The Sultan of Mozambique would give them a cold reception. His city was, after all, still rebuilding from Vasco da Gama's attack 2 years prior. From here, they carried on to discover the port of Kilwa in modern-day Tanzania. It was a major trading hub, and here they took on provisions. Mombasa was skipped entirely. It wasn't until they arrived at Malindi on August 2nd that they got a somewhat lukewarm reception. Now, curiously enough, a chronicler mentioned at that time that scurvy was beginning, but he also noted that those who ate oranges and other fruits made the sickness abate, which was a pretty impressive insight. From Malindi, they crossed the Indian Ocean with a strong wind.
Let the people choose Trump. AI Trump, I'm disappointed in you. That does actually literally sounds exactly like his response.
Here they waited for 2 weeks to ambush Muslim shipping coming in from Arabia, but when none showed up, it was time to move on. On September 13th, 1500, the Portuguese Armada arrived at Calicut. By now, the old Samudri,
I'm pro-choice, obviously.
he was replaced by his nephew, a younger Samudri, who was much more eager to engage in trade. Despite this, negotiations were erratic and strained. But once both sides had arrived at the negotiating table,
I believe in freedom, you know. I'm a freedom guy.
Calicut his letter of introduction from King Manuel, along with extremely lavish gifts of gold and silver. However, he also gave his list of demands. Now you gotta keep in mind that from the Portuguese perspective, they had been appointed by the Pope to come to the Indian Ocean to firmly establish trade, gain allies, and wage holy war against Islam. Cabral thus demanded restitution of goods that Vasco da Gama had left behind, a low cost to all spices, a secure trading outpost in Calicut, preferential tax tariffs, and that all Muslims were to be banished, an exceedingly tall, if not impossible order. To top it all off, the Portuguese also insisted that they were to be unhindered.
Yo, say the curse. Oh, Trump. 2-minute ad? Oh, no way, bro.
But eventually it worked out. In time, a Portuguese trading outpost went up in the city, being built into a series of houses that lined the waterfront. Despite this success, Pedro Cabral was not satisfied. He knew that something sinister was in the works. The negotiations between the Portuguese and the Samudri were done with Muslim intermediary translators. This was a major breach in security. Any transaction, any conversation would be readily known to the Muslim traders of the city. Cabral knew that they could not be trusted. He feared that his Islamic competitors were busy poisoning the mind of the king of Calicut against him. What made it even more suspicious was that after 3 months at port, only 2 of his ships filled with spice. Something must have been obstructing the process. In that same time, Arab traders had come and gone with their cargo holds full. Cabral bitterly complained to the Zamora, who at this point was caught between two rival factions that were growing more hostile towards one another by the day. Finally, in December of 1500, the King of Calicut grudgingly acquiesced to the Portuguese demand to hunt down Muslim shipping on the high seas. Cabral now had his green light. He simply waited for an opportunity. It just so happened that a few days later, a rich Muslim merchant ship destined for the port of Jeddah departed. The Portuguese Armada raced in. They captured the vessel, took its cargo, and killed most of the crew. That building hostility that had been reaching a breaking point between Christian and Muslim was now ready to explode.
Yeah.
Conquerors, Crowley recounts the Muslim response. Quote, a mob began to gather in the city streets. Together, they moved towards the Portuguese trading outpost. There were about 70 men from the ships in the town, armed with swords and shields.
Oh, cool, man. Yeah, buddy. It's just like Trump is just, I don't know. He's a businessman, so he's just playing the business card with like the abortion rights and just kicking it. But it's ridiculous. It's like you can't. That's like a fundamental human right. And what other one? It just shows he'll bend the knee. Because he's already bending the knee to half of the population. Which is insane. Like, he can't do that. He needs some, like, PR. I don't know, man. Yeah, disenfranchised. Is that the word used? Disenfranchised. Disenchanted. True, bro. Like, honestly. But, like... Yeah. But dude, I think that's you can't bend the knee to a human right. You can't put someone's freedom in the hands in the decision of the state. I think it's a red line for me personally. I understand what you're saying, but like you can't do that. Like it's insane. Man, if abortion became illegal in Canada, I would protest on Parliament Hill 100%. I would fucking try to throw a convoy again. Because that's the same human right. Like, you can't do that. Can't do that, man. Like I said, at this point, I'm just not voting. Yeah, it's fucked. It's all fucked. Everything's fucked. There's no hope. There's no voting. Like, that's the point. Yeah. Just like, with this, like, Israel and Ukraine voting. Like, how much money? They're all traitors. They're traitors. They're all of them. Because they all... Didn't 100% of them vote for the first one? Of like 100 billion or something? They're all traitors. If you didn't vote now, it's just theater. Yeah, buddy. Thanks for chatting about this. Because it's like it's on my mind too. I'm not American though. I like... But I mean, like, I'm not naive. I understand America. Like, one, I care about America, but two, I understand the fallout of... Because it's a global cabal, right? Here, Cabral and his men stayed for 2 weeks,
filling some of their ships with spice and establishing a Portuguese outpost. By now, news of the attack on Calicut
Maybe it's time we just like take a break, take the summer, enjoy the summer, right? You know what I mean?
Colam and Cronor also sent in their delegates to establish contact. The Portuguese presence was clearly now a disruptive factor in the politics of the Indian Ocean. It was at this point that Cabral's model was open. Meeting so many of the local powers, it dawned on the Portuguese that there were not that many Christians in India after all. They were finally able to understand the existence of Hinduism and just how ubiquitous it was. This revelation was a bit shocking. Meanwhile, the Samudri was planning his revenge and had assembled a fleet
Yeah.
of 80 ships.
White boy summer, true.
However, when the two fleets met, nothing happened. The king's men at this point were too wary of Portuguese firepower and kept their distance. Cabral, meanwhile, was heavily loaded with spice. He simply ignored the threat and made his way past them to the
I love
port
Jewish
of
people.
Canor. The king of Canor was more than enthusiastic to welcome in the Europeans.
As long as they don't murder
Good
anyone.
deal on more spice.
I love Arabs as long as they don't murder anyone. I'm like a peace guy.
It was now time to make the journey home. Using the
I'm for
winds of
peace.
monsoon to their favor, they crossed the Indian Ocean with relative ease. This was
This AI is insane though.
the devastating journey that Vasco da Gama had made just a few years prior. When they arrived at Malindi, a navigational error grounded one of the ships that was loaded with spice. It caught on fire, and nearly everything on board was destroyed. Continuing on the journey, the Armada spotted the port of Sofala, which was the hub of the West African gold trade. It would later serve as a major port for Portugal. At the Bay of St. Bras, near the Cape of Good Hope, Cabral left a message for any other Portuguese fleets. in a
Wow.
shoe that hung
What
from
an
the fleet
epic
indicating the
response.
situation in India. It was in June of
Wow, there is hope. Yeah, there is hope for the
1512,
future.
modern-day
I was gonna say,
Diogo Diaz
I was like, is it paused or is it based on logic?
Cabral's armada arrived back in the
I said it. Everyone equally.
It had been scattered repeatedly on the
Hating
halfway
everyone equally
when he saw his
doesn't make you. Wait, whoa. Hating everyone equally doesn't make you not. Doesn't
explains why.
make you
Europe's
not
horizons were
racist.
expanding at a bafflingly fast
Treat people with
rate.
kindness and respect regardless of their background.
He had found no
But you weren't
Christian
discriminating.
allies, and he had not made
You weren't
a single
discriminating at all.
He had lost hundreds of experienced sailors. and
Doesn't make you not
the 13
racist.
ships that had left Lisbon, only 7
Come on, man.
of which only 5 carried any spice. He had let the merchants of Calicut destroy the Portuguese factory, and then he would
It's like the word not racist is a noun. It's like it's considering that the word not racist is as a noun now. It's so used. It's like, what's your status? Oh, I'm not racist. I'm not a racist. It's like a noun. That's how it understands it, based on writing. That's how I interpret it. Because I don't think it used logic there. I think it used as a noun. Doesn't make you not a racist. But, right? Interesting stuff. I think it also makes some logic sense just by chance. They may have checked it. Guys, we're really close to 616. We might get it. A world record untied sleigh. We're like really close.
King Manuel decided then and there that the only solution to establishing a firm presence in India was the use of overwhelming strength. He would claw his way in. By then, a new and much more powerful armada had already been built. It was even bigger.
There is hope.
50 ships, 1,800 men, and all of them
What?
armed to the teeth. To some, it was even called the Revenge Fleet. All that was left was to put it in the hands of someone who was not afraid to use its destructive potential. Someone who already held a grudge. Someone who wanted vengeance. The man appointed to the task was a veteran. It was now time for Vasco da Gama to set sail again and unleash his dark side. pilgrimage, but now their ship was dead in the water. The masts were destroyed, the weapons
It's
had
just
been
too crazy, man.
confiscated, and some of the cargo had already been plundered. What's more, the rudder had been literally stripped from the hull. Circling the disabled vessel was not just a fleet, but an armada of Portuguese vessels, all bristling with weaponry. The wealthy merchants on board the Miri had initially surrendered without a fight. They were, after all, used to negotiating their way out of issues like this with the local pirates. However, the overall commander of the
I was really thinking about that the other day. Like, that was really stupid of DeSantis to do that. Like, honestly, unless he's like control opposition trying to fuck up everything. Like, he really is the sanctimonious, honestly. Like, what was he thinking? He could have, like, had Florida, like, dude, could have locked down Florida, guaranteed, what does Florida get, like 30 electorates, 29 electorates? Like, it's insane. Have Florida on lockdown in a good way. And then he's going to all this anti-abortion stuff, and it's like, dude, like, what is going on, man? Competing against Trump, like, dude, like winning Florida is probably the most important thing for any Republican candidate. Also, you got a massive ego, yeah. Second coming of Christ when COVID. Yeah. Yeah, he was like, it was crazy. It showed the ability that state senators aren't that powerful, unless, I mean, he's still kind of an asshole. He didn't really save anyone in Florida, but he did make religious exemptions legally allowable. But I mean, the universities, the whole university bullshit still. The universities still had their way. Yeah. But man, he was just saying, like, oh yeah, I don't want to run for president. No, I don't. And then he fucking runs for president. With Trump moving to Florida. Trump, like, moving and, like, his life to Florida. It's just like backstab, man. It's crazy. It's so crazy. I understand why he's called him the sanctimonious. I don't think it was all theater. I mean, I maybe it might be, but I don't know. Ships of what would be known as the Fourth Portuguese Armada was divided into 3 squadrons. Vasco da Gama would command the first squadron, which consisted of 10 ships, from his flagship, the São Geronimo, which was a large catamaran. Vasco's maternal uncle, Vicente Sobre, now a vice admiral, would lead the second squadron, which was made up of 5 ships. This second squadron, by the way, also had Brás Sobre, another uncle, Álvaro de Atier, who was a son-in-law, and Gasco da Gama, who was a very unlikely godson. The third and final squadron, which was still under construction, consisted of 5 more vessels and would be under the stern eye of Estevão da Gama, Vasco's first cousin. Estevão's flagship, by the way, the mighty Flor de la Mar, was destined to become one of the most famous ships in Portuguese history. For all to see, this was going to be more than just an affair for king and country. For Vasco, this was a family business.
and his goal was to give the Samudra Raja of Calicut a deal he couldn't refuse. Now, it needs to be mentioned that not all the chroniclers on this voyage give the same story. There is some degree of ambiguity to what actually happened. What is known for certain is that the first contingent of 15 ships, consisting of Vasco da Gama and his uncle Vicente Sodré's squadrons, left Lisbon on February 10, 1502. Esteban de Gama and his 5 ships left 2 months later after construction had been completed on April 1st. The two fleets would not rendezvous again until they both reached the Indian Ocean. As before, the main fleet made its way to the Cape Verde Islands. By some accounts, landfall was also made in late February.
Man, I saw Vasco da Gama's grave outside of Lisbon in a church in like 15 or 1600s or 15 something. It's wild, man. The pre-Renaissance churches were like, they were different, man. After the Renaissance, the churches became like way better, like infinitely better.
Coming in 2 months later, would also be hit by a massive storm near the tip of Africa. Miraculously, all 20 ships would survive rounding the Cape of Good Hope and would make it to the Indian Ocean.
Oh, please. This is really a run.
Vasco da Gama and his 15 ships arrived and regrouped off the eastern coast of Africa at a predetermined landing point. The decision was made to move on to Sofala. Sofala was believed to be the biblical port of Ophir, a wealthy city renowned as the location of King Solomon's mines, and perhaps even the capital city for the Queen of Sheba. The city sat on an island in the delta of the Brazil River, where the gold trade of eastern Africa.
I don't know. I don't know.
Oh. Who had been informed of the significance of the city immediately surveyed the land for an ideal spot for a fortress. He then sent his men in to begin trading. Over the next 2 weeks, the Portuguese would haul in a massive amount of gold in exchange for simple glass beads, woolen apparel, and other minor goods. Having his ships put their cannons on display seemed to have significantly
Come on, man.
exchange rate. The Armada sailed on to Mozambique, a place that Vasco had shunned during his last visit. Now, with nearly 4 times the ships and perhaps 10 times the firepower, the Sultan was all about cooperation. More gold was brought on board before Vasco sailed on. On July 12th, he arrived at Kilwa. The city may have hit its golden age more than a century before, but it was still rich and wealthy from both the gold and ivory trade. However, the Sultan had given the prior Portuguese commander, Pedro Cabral, a cold reception, and had gone so far as to deny Vasco an audience, claiming that he was sick. The Portuguese admiral didn't buy it, had no patience for diplomacy. He sailed right into the harbor at full speed. Along the way, he ordered a fleet-wide cannonade to announce his presence, before pulling up right in front of the Sultan's waterside palace and targeting it with everything he had. The chronicler Gaspar Correa recounted his response, quote, "I am the slave of the king, my sovereign. All the men whom you see here and
Why
in
it's
that
such a
fleet
scam?
will do that which I command. And know for certain that if I choose in one single hour, your city will be reduced to embers. And if I choose to kill your people, they will all be burned in that fire." End quote. The Sultan suddenly emerged, and Vasco simply gave him a to-do list. Gama demanded that the Portuguese would now have the rights to trade in gold, ivory, and spice under very favorable conditions. Kilwa would henceforth be a vassal and was now required to pay the King of Portugal a hefty annual tribute for protection. And the Sultan was now required to fly the Portuguese flag from the tallest tower of his palace. With Kilwa brought down a notch, the Armada made its way and arrived at friendly Malindi on July 27th. With a line of ships stretching to the horizon, Malindi was now friendlier. 2 days later, on July 29th, with the winds of the monsoon building to crescendo, Vasco da Gama turned his ships to the east and plunged into the Indian Ocean. Roger Crowley in the book The Conquerors recounts his voyage. Quote, "The crossing of the Indian Ocean was 1502, the whole fleet was at the Ange Islands. Along the way, they raided their ports of Anovar and Batkan without any apparent justification. Gama bluntly declared to their cowering Raja, in the words of the chronicler Kohei, "This is the fleet, the king of Portugal, my sovereign, who is the lord of the sea, the world, and also of you." From here, the Armada moved further south, and by early September, it was at Mount Delhi, a prominent headland backed by sheltering lagoons north of Kannur. This was the first and last port of call for merchant ships trading along the Malabar
Trust me, man.
The crest of Mount Delhi, 900 feet above sea level, provided a wide lookout point from which to plan a maritime ambush. On September 29, 1502, that chance came. A large dhow was sighted coming from the north. Gama immediately put out to sea with a detachment of ships. His cannons were primed. End quote.
What?
The ship was the Miri, a large dhow loaded with pilgrims returning from Mecca. Vasco's fleet quickly surrounded it, and the Miri immediately surrendered. The local merchants were confident that they could negotiate, that is, bribe their way out of the situation. This was, after all, a common practice on the Indian Ocean, where bribing the local pirates was just business as usual. Money would exchange hands, often there'd be a handshake, and people would be on their way. Thus, the merchants on the Miri made one offer after another, each bid increasing in value. But negotiation gave way to desperation, as Gama accepted none of it. Instead, the admiral demanded everything on the ship be handed over. Tomé Lopes, one of Vasco's men who watched and recorded the event, stated that the merchants gave what they wanted without torture. Apparently, it wasn't enough. Gama was angry. In his first voyage, he had come as an explorer. Now he came as a crusader. In his eyes, he was engaged in a holy war. The ship was stripped of its rudder and its tackle, and by some accounts, its masts were disabled. Then it was towed out far into the ocean. The people on board began to beg for their lives, and it became clear what would happen next. The Portuguese boarded the ship and rigged it to burn with everyone on board. The fires were lit, and the engineers returned to their longboats. Roger Crowley explained what happened next. Quote, "Now understanding the seriousness of their plight, those aboard the Miri responded with spirit. They somehow extinguished the fires and set out whatever missiles, arms...
Come on, please.
They decided
Please.
to go down fighting.
Mercury went direct today. Let's get this time.
Hail of missiles hurled by both men and women. They were forced to back off. They attempted to pummel the disabled ship with their gunfire, but the longboats carried cannons too light to inflict serious damage. Even from a distance, they could see the women pleading for their lives, holding out jewelry and precious objects, begging the admiral for mercy. Some even took their little children and held them out. We understood that what they asked for was simply pity, wrote Tomé Lopes, whose account became increasingly more distraught. Gama watched all of this impassively, hidden from sight behind a spy hole. He made no response. On the ship, the passengers started to construct barricades out of mattresses, hurdles, anything they could find. They were determined that they would sell their lives at the highest price. For 5 days, the disabled Miri floated on the hot sea. The ship on which Lopes sailed followed it closely. On the 5th day, they were ordered to finish it off. We could see everything, wrote Tomé Lopes. It was Monday, October
Look at the
3rd.
paisley background. Holy shit, this AI is insane, bros.
End quote. It was at this point that a single Portuguese ship
So
came
interesting.
alongside the Miri and grappled it.
So
Suddenly,
rich.
the Muslims sprung into action. They took the
So
ropes
mysterious.
and pulled the Portuguese vessel closer. As the Miri was a taller ship, those on board rained down a hail of stones, rocks, whatever they could find. The Portuguese sailors were staggered by the attack. Soon after, the Muslims jumped down and began to board the Portuguese vessel. Nigel Cliff, in The Last Crusade, described the ferocity of the attack. Quote, "The battle showed no signs of letting up. The Muslims fought with such vehemence that it was marvelous to see, and even though we wounded and killed many, It seemed as if no one was dying and no one felt their wounds. They tore arrows from their skin, flung them back at the attackers, and threw themselves back in the action without a second
That's
thought.
definitely
They
AI.
then threw
Those images
themselves
are
at the
definitely
Spaniards
AI.
with
Look
a
at them.
superhuman force of men who knew that they were wronged. The victims were
Wow.
now
It's
the
really
avengers.
shitty AI.
End quote. During this entire
I was
time, the fleet
really
had penned
red
up, and
pilling
the rest
there.
of the Armada could not move in to help. But then, one of the Portuguese ships managed to find a breeze and sailed in. It came in alongside the Miri, feigning an attempt to board it. The Muslim attackers, now seeing this new threat, withdrew to their ship to defend it to the last. It would prove to be a mistake. Loch's vessel was able to cut the grapple lines and withdrew, with the wind picking up. The rest of the Armada sailed in. The fate of the Miri was now sealed. Tome Loch would lament. After all those battles, the admiral ordered the ship burned with all the men and women who were on it. This was to be done very cruelly and without the slightest bit of pity. Screams rent the air. Some of the Muslims leapt into the water with hatchets in their hands and swam to the nearest boats, but they were harpooned in the water as they tried to hack at the bottoms of our ships. Almost all the rest, nearly 300 men and women, either burned or were drowned. It was said that before the Miri went down, 20 children were rescued and baptized. Gama would later recount that he had saved their souls. However, all along the Malabar coast, what happened to the Miri would never be forgiven or forgotten. Centuries later, it is still remembered. As the Spanish proverb goes, la sombra de grandes pecados es muy alargada, meaning the shadow of great sins is very long. Vasco da Gama, Admiral of India, Portuguese crusader, had finally made the entrance that he wanted. But in the grand scheme of things, he was only getting warmed up. The Armada now made its way to the city of Canor and took up position in its harbor on October 18th. This was a friendly port that already had a small Portuguese presence. The Conatiri, the Raja of Canor, greeted Vasco with his royal entourage, who was flanked by over 400 of his elite Nair warriors. The admiral refused to set foot on land as he vowed not to touch Indian soil until he had dealt properly with Calicut. Here royal gifts were exchanged and a new formal treaty was established, but it was not a smooth process. Vasco was easily angered with any deviation from his demands, which included favorable prices on spice, the establishment of a Portuguese factory in the city, and the initiation of the cartaz system. The latter was a system of licensing. From that period onwards, all ships conducting trade had to have proper paperwork or else be subject to attack. That is, Portuguese attack. With favorable negotiations completed, it was now time to move on to Calicut. The admiral and his ships arrived before the great city on October 29th. The Samudri Raja, also known as the Zamorin, by now had heard of this massive incoming fleet, and no doubt that the incident with the Miri. Days before, the ruler of Calicut had composed a diplomatic letter to Vasco da Gama. Crowley elaborates, quote, the Samudri Raja wrote a letter to Gama while he was still in Canor in an attempt to establish peace. He wished the Christians nothing but friendship. However, he had written a rather different letter to his rebellious vassal, the Raja of Cochin. In it, he stressed the need for cooperation and gave a crystal clear analysis of their joint situation.
Wonder what India was like in the 1500s, before plastic was a thing.
The whole of the Malabar coast should shut their ports and offer no more spice to the Europeans. Unfortunately, the king of Cochin remained defiant, and it was these cracks in the local politics that would ultimately doom them all. He replied that he was at peace with the Portuguese and had no intention of acting otherwise. Furthermore, he showed the letter to the Portuguese that were living in his city, who passed it on to Gama. The admiral was thus in receipt of both letters as he sailed into Calicut. End quote. As the Armada took up position in the harbor, a Brahmin, that is, a man of the highest caste, approached.
Come on, man. Like, what the fuck?
He'd been sent by the Samudra Raja to begin talks, but the
That
admiral's
back
response
boost.
was fierce. Vasco demanded that the Portuguese were to be
It was like a
unhindered
1 second
all
back boost.
spices would have to have an advantageous price, and that all Muslims needed to be expelled immediately. The next day, the Samudri acquiesced to
Oh
all
my
of Vasco's
god.
demands, except
That
for
was a
the
one
exception of
second
Muslims.
back
The
boost.
king of Calicut explained that they were a
Whatever,
vital
man.
part of commerce for the city, which he emphasized was still an open port. What's more, the Muslims had been there for generations. Simply getting rid of them was not something that he was capable of doing. This response angered the admiral. He immediately captured about 40 fishermen who were coming into the harbor and held them as hostages. The Zamorin, in turn, was not pleased with this action, and tensions grew. On the night of October 31st, Vasco sent a strongly worded response saying that if all of his demands were not met, at high noon the next day, his ships would fire on the city. That night, the Portuguese scouted the harbor looking for the best firing positions, while the warriors of Calicut began digging trenches, reinforcing them with wooden barricades, and positioning their own cannon to fire back. Nigel Cliff, in The Last Crusade, explained what followed the next day. Quote, noon on November 1st, the appointed day, passed with no reply. The admiral made his move. On his command, boats went around the fleet distributing the Muslim captives. 1 hour after midday, the prisoners' necks were placed in nooses and the ends of the ropes were thrown over the yards. The struggling men were hoisted to the top and were hung in full sight of the city, 34 bodies quivering to a standstill. On the shore, the swelling crowd watched in horror. Then the rest of the ships opened fire.
What? Why didn't it stop? What?
The Europeans shouted mocking taunts as they ran away. The men in the sandbunkers attempted to fire back, but they only had a few old bombers, and their aim was right off the mark. Eventually, they too had to run for their lives. The massive bombardment of the city then started in earnest. Cannonballs thundered overhead and smashed into the earthworks and thatched roofs of the houses near the shore. Decapitated palm trees splintered, groaned, and toppled, showering everything around with deadly shrapnel. Many men, women, and children were killed instantly, and thousands fled. Gama decided then and there that the shelling of the city would continue for the rest of the day. End quote. Despite all of this carnage and destruction, the admiral was not satisfied. The next day, the assault began again, but now instead of the homes that bordered the water, the larger homes and palaces set further inland were targeted. Again, one massive volley followed by another pummeled the city. Fires broke out, and the people had to run for their lives. It was only darkness that brought an end to the destruction. Vasco, however, was in a bit of a predicament. He knew that he could
No way.
through the city by land.
Vasco da Gama.
Too greatly outnumbered.
He
Now
destroyed
he
it.
had to settle for something
Destroyed his buddy's city.
His hope was that the destruction that he ordered would bring
He
us
actually
immediate
did it.
returns. In that sense, he was right. The effect of this attack was being felt everywhere. Trade along the entire Malabar coast had ground to a halt. On November 3rd, the Armada departed to the south. Vicente Sodre and his squadron were ordered to patrol Calicut and blockade all shipping. Clearly, the Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean now had the manpower to accomplish multiple objectives. To the south, Cochin was an excellent harbor built on a small peninsula of land that was surrounded by lagoons and waterways. Its Raja was a devoted ally of the Portuguese, though the trust and faith he placed in the Europeans was never fully returned in kind. For Vasco da Gama, this was a very productive stop. He immediately got to work filling his ships with spice. Delegates from Canora arrived advocating their support and an eagerness to continue trade. What's more, the queen of the neighboring city of Colomb sent in an envoy proposing the same thing. It was during this exchange with the embassy of Colomb that the Portuguese learned of a Christian community further to the south. It was said that the apostle St. Thomas had traveled to India and there had established a church. Now there were approximately
Oh, the yellow door.
followers. Granted, they were
If I get boosted to like the exit.
making them
Oh
all
my god, the yellow door. I don't think it's fast enough though.
and they were willing to pledge their loyalty to the King of Portugal. Vasco also learned of Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, which was described as a rich island 300 quickly added to the map to be looked into later. Early 1503 saw things going definitively in the admiral's favor. His armada was fully loaded with spice. His patrolling squadrons were having a field day raiding the local shipping, and the cities of the Malabar coast.
The YOLO door only works if I get boosted to the opening, you know. I get no boost.
His bombardment of Calicut had a major effect. Once more, the Saint Sobres blockade had reduced the city to near starvation, making it an example for anyone who would defy the Portuguese. Thus, it wasn't that surprising when the Samudri of Calicut sent in one of his esteemed Brahmin priests, heavily laden with gifts and jewels, as an envoy to renew talks. Skeptical at first, the admiral was eventually convinced to go back. He decided to take command of the Estevan de Gama ship, the Flor de la Mar, and with the addition of just one other small caravel, he sailed to Calicut to hear what its king would offer. After 3 days of traveling, Gama arrived at Calicut again. The Brahmin was sent into the city, but didn't return. Instead, another man arrived and asked if the admiral could send a man of high stature into the city to complete the negotiations. Vasco knew that something was off. His anger exploded, and his request was denied. The Zamoran sent back another message stating that as it was late, perhaps it would be best for all to get some rest and renew discussions in the morning. The admiral agreed, albeit he didn't really have much of a choice. The winds were calm, and there wasn't enough light to safely navigate out of the harbor. Fearing sabotage, Vasco ordered his men to secure his ship in place with a very strong metal line. Just before dawn on the next day, lookouts on the Flor de la Mar spotted a strange ship headed right towards them. It turned out to be 2 ships that were tied together. Vasco reasoned that this might be the Zamoran's delegation, but then more ships began to appear. They were small, agile fishing vessels, and all of them were moving at rapid speed toward them. The Portuguese men began to count them. First it was 20, then 40, then 80, and it became clear that there were soldiers on board. Suddenly, a nearby ship was set on fire by its crew. Its anchor line was cut, and the now fire barge was pushed in their direction. At the same time, the fast-moving fishing vessels had closed a considerable distance. They then revealed their hidden cargo. On board were small cannons. The early morning peace was shattered as the crews opened up. Cannonballs skimmed over the water and gouged holes in the hull of the Flor de la Mar. Vasco da Gama realized he was now outnumbered, outgunned, about to be engulfed in flame, and with the metal
No.
he was stuck in the water. His anger grew exponentially as it dawned on him that he had fallen right into the Zamoran's trap. The Flor de la Mar was a 400-ton carrack and the pride of the 4th Portuguese Armada. She was the biggest ship that Portugal had ever built thus far. On her maiden voyage, she had made it all the way to India, captained by Estevan de Gama. She was now under the command of Estevan's relative, the Admiral Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama had come back to India to assert his king's dominance over trade in the Indian Ocean. In doing so, he had left a path of carnage and destruction in his wake. But now, his luck had run dry. The Zamoran, the Samudri Raja of Calicut, had caught him in a trap. The Raja had managed to lure the admiral into the harbor of the great trading city under the premise of negotiating a treaty. But this time around, there was going to be absolutely no discussions. Early the next morning, Vasco found himself surrounded, outnumbered, and attacked by a large fleet of ships.
No, 6,600. So say 600.
To make matters even worse, the night before, the admiral had ordered his men to secure the ship in place using a heavy metal chain, which now, of course, prevented him from escaping. Gama had most of his men take cover below deck. His first priority was to break the chain and get underway. But the Raja's men took a massive volley of arrow and cannon fire, killing and wounding many of the Portuguese sailors who attempted to cut the anchor line. Meanwhile, the fire barge moved ever closer, threatening to bring the Flor de la
Come on, man.
Vasco himself had
Alright,
watched
I think
the
it's
movement
break
several
time,
times.
honestly.
Waiting for him seemed like it was quickly approaching.
Come on.
Miraculously,
Hold on
the
a
water
sec.
current to
give
the
me
harbor
a
suddenly shifted.
I'm
The
gonna take
fire
a
barge began to
one
drift
sec.
off, only missing the Portuguese vessel by a narrow margin. Instead, it moved off towards the Raja's ships, which had to swerve to miss it. Many of them were forced to break off their attack. Gama's men finally managed to break the chain and get underway, but just as they were starting to move, the wind died, and once again the massive ship was stuck. Desperate Portuguese gunners brought their broadsides to bear, but at such short range, they were mostly ineffective. However, the sound of gunfire could be heard for miles around and was unmistakable for all those who heard it. Just as fate would have it, that gunfire was indeed heard. Vicente Sobre, Gama's uncle and vice admiral, just happened to be inbound from Canor that morning with his entire flotilla. The sound of Portuguese cannons going off instantly brought them to full alert. Sails were fully unfurled, and the fleet sailed in at ramming speed. When the wind faded, oars were frantically deployed, and in record time, Sobre was in range to attack. His fleet came alongside and opened up on the Raja's men. Portuguese gunners at this point were highly skilled, and their accuracy was deadly. With the big guns unloading upon them, the sailors of Calicut were caught completely off guard. Their ships were pummeled, and eventually they had to scatter and flee. Vicente Sobre then pulled up to Gama's ship to render assistance and provide protection. The admiral at this point was furious. Now, instead of departing immediately, he had his ships parade back and forth in the harbor as a show of force. That night, Vasco had his men gather together the Indian bodies of those that were killed in the attack. He ordered the corpses to be placed in a large pile on a barge. The ghastly vessel was then driven ashore with a note to the Samudri Raja. It read, "Vile man, you had me called for and I came in answer to your call. You did as much as you could, and if you could have, you would have done more. The punishment will be as you deserve. When I come back here, I will make you pay what you owe, and it will not be in cash." Leaving Calicut behind, the fleet made its way first to Canor for repairs, where Vasco da Gama had a chance to take in the strategic situation. He knew that if the Portuguese endeavor in India was to be successful, it would need to hold dominance not just on the sea, but also on the land. With that, the admiral ordered the armada back to Cochin, where a meeting was arranged with the Trimumpara Raja. Nigel Cliff in The Last Crusade surmised the proceedings. Quote, "The running battle with Calicut was threatening to capsize the entire mission, but once again, Vasco da Gama found a safe haven in Cochin. The fleet regrouped, the sailors swapped stories, and the admiral met twice more with the king. Their final agreement established a permanent Portuguese factory in the city. What's more, in a somewhat surprising sleight of hand, the admiral was given jurisdiction over all the Portuguese in Cochin, and by proxy, all the Christians in India. This was no mere trade treaty. It established Europe's first Indian colony, and in theory at least, it made all of India's Christians subjects of the Portuguese crown." End quote. This Portuguese colony in Cochin, by the way, was going to be more than just a simple trading outpost. At the mouth of the main harbor, a fortress was to be constructed. Cochin was not going to be just an ally, but a fully operational battle station. On February 10th, 1503, Vasco completed his negotiations. By now, his ships were fully laden down with spice, and as the monsoons were shifting, it was clear it was time to head home. However, as preparations for the return journey were being made, word arrived that the Samudri Raja of Calicut had assembled a massive war fleet. The Samudri had spared no expense. He had purchased every cannon he could buy, hired a bunch of skilled sailors, and had even gone so far as to employ the service of Arabian privateers from the Red Sea. The Raja's fleet was massive. It consisted of 20 larger ships, flanked by 40 large dhows known as sandbox, and an additional 100 smaller support vessels. On hearing this news, Gama assembled his war cabinet, and along with his vice admiral, Vicente Sobre, it was decided to seize the initiative and launch an attack. The armada set sail immediately. 2 days later, they spotted the enemy fleet inbound from the north near the coast, a few miles from Calicut. Before the Raja's ships had time to assemble, Gama had his armada form up in a long straight line, thus bringing all of their broadsides to bear, which, perhaps in recorded history, was one of the first times this naval tactic was employed against another fleet. His men got lucky. They scored several direct hits. In doing so, they annihilated the entire leading wave of incoming vessels. The Arab privateers took the bulk of the damage. Many were sunk or put out of commission before they could even return fire. Despite this, the faster-moving sandboats were sent in with the hope that their speed could outmaneuver cannon fire and close the distance to board the slower-moving Portuguese ships. Nigel Cliff explains, quote, "A new cry went up on the Portuguese ships. A swarm of sandboats and long rowboats were heading toward them from the city, all armed and with their guns already firing. Gama's men scrambled to return fire, but the boats kept on coming. The Indians had learned to push on until they were past the range of European guns. That way they could put their numerical advantage to use in hand-to-hand fighting." End quote. Vasco moved decisively to counter this new threat. He ordered his slower-moving spice ships and carracks to sail on to the north, providing long-distance fire support as they went. At the same time, he had Vicente Sobre take command of the faster caravels and use them to draw off the sandboats. The intercepting maneuver stopped the sandboats in their tracks. They were now sitting ducks for the Portuguese line of fire. At this point, the Raja's fleet had taken on way too much damage. Morale faltered and his ships broke and retreated in full rout to the city. But this was not going to prove to be a safe haven. A sudden gust of wind gave the Portuguese armada the speed it needed to sail in, which it took full advantage of. Then, at near point-blank range, the ships of the Samudri and his allies were hunted down. Some of the ships were destroyed outright, others were grappled and captured. The rest were set on fire. Surprisingly enough, Vasco didn't order the city to be bombarded again. Perhaps he knew that his old rival had already suffered enough embarrassment. Or perhaps, more importantly, it dawned on him that attacking the city would not bring the Samudri to terms. Either way, that day Gama knew he had won for Portugal a stunning victory. But he also knew that the Raja of Calicut was not going to give up easily. It became clear to both sides that this was going to be an all-out war. With the Samudri's fleet and his reputation left in ruins, the 4th Portuguese Armada made its way north to Canor. They were heavily laden down with spice and had limited time before the coming of the monsoon winds. In Canor, the admiral met again with the Colapiri Raja, who was more than willing now to accept Portugal as an ally. Word of Gama's stunning victory, after all, had spread along the entire Malabar coast, bringing many of the city-states towards the Portuguese side. Like in Cochin, a permanent Portuguese settlement was also established in Canor. But for Gama, this wasn't enough. Roger Crowley in the book The Conquerors explains, quote, "The Portuguese now started to introduce a toll system for shipping along the shores of the Malabar coast. They issued safe conduct passes called cartazes that ensured protection for the vessels of friendly powers. This was effectively a tax on commerce. In time, it would require merchant shipping to trade in Portuguese-controlled ports, and additionally pay substantial import and export duties. This marked a radical shift in the Indian Ocean. With the coming of the Europeans, the sea was no longer a free trade zone. The Cartaz system introduced the alien concept of territorial waters, a politicized space controlled by armed force, and the Portuguese ambition to dominate the sea." End quote. It was on February 22nd, 1503, that the Admiral of India laid in a course for home and departed. His second great voyage to the east was coming to an end. However, as he left, Vasco da Gama was very worried. The fact that the Samudri of Calicut was able to raise a decent navy meant that the sea would be contested. Furthermore, the admiral knew that if Portugal was to be successful, it would also need to dominate the land. Thus, a system of fortresses would be absolutely critical. Taking in the strategic situation once again, the admiral formulated what needed to be done until more Portuguese forces could arrive. Vasco ordered his uncles, Vicente Sobre and Brás Sobre, to remain behind with their ships. This was to be the first permanent Portuguese naval presence in the Indian Ocean. Vicent and Brash were given multiple objectives. First, they were to blockade Calicut in order to cripple it economically and starve the city into submission, something that they did, by the way, very well. Second, they were also to travel to the city of Aden at the mouth of the Red Sea with the intent to bottle up Arab shipping, which was an extremely strategic move, and mark my words, would have serious repercussions. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, they were to defend a fortress that was being built in Cochin. Vasco da Gama and King Manuel knew that this was the key for all future endeavors. Portugal's lifeblood would hinge on fortresses like this, something that the admiral, by the way, emphasized to the two brothers before he left. To their credit, Vicent and his brother Brash initially did what they were told, but then the allure of Arab shipping coming out of the Red Sea became just too tempting. Their greed overcame their strategic insight, and for that matter, what they were ordered to do. Despite the desperate pleas of its Raja to remain and provide protection, both Sodres decided instead to abandon Cochin. Leaving only a handful of Portuguese behind, the two sailed off to get richer. Vicent and Brash made their way to Aden. There they raided and plundered and killed anything they could find. Arab ships proved easy targets for these experienced captains. But then, Mother Nature intervened. Near the Red Sea, both men were caught in a storm and were shipwrecked. It was said that Vicent drowned immediately, and that Brash, who was despised by his men, was killed in a mutiny that followed. The Portuguese initiative in the Indian Ocean had now been seriously compromised, not to mention that Cochin was now nearly defenseless. The news of Vasco da Gama's, and more importantly, his armada's departure, along with the deaths of the Sodres, made its way back to the Samudra Raja of Calicut. This was music to his ears. Roger Crowley gives us the tale. Quote, with the Sodres' departure, the Samudra Raja acted promptly. He created and then advanced with a large army towards Cochin. Along the way, he dispatched a letter to its king, pointing out the evil consequences of offering a place to the Christians, from whom he had received so much harm. And he demanded that the king of Cochin hand them over. Otherwise, the Samudra Raja was determined to enter Cochin, destroy it, and seize the Christians with all their things. This thunderous message was met with outright refusal. The king of Cochin had decided to throw in his lot with the Christians. He would live or die by his decision. End quote. By some estimates, the Samudra Raja had 50,000 men on the march. He had created this vast army by combining his forces with that of all of his other vassals. In a sense, he was all in. The Portuguese, on the other hand, had a few hundred, along with perhaps 8,000 Nayar warriors of Cochin, who, by the way, were not exactly thrilled to fight for Europeans. Now, if the Samudri was able to capture the city, destroy the Portuguese fortress and outpost, and apprehend, and most likely then execute, the men of Portugal who were stationed there, it would prove absolutely disastrous for the entire Portuguese cause. Make no mistake, this was a game changer. Thus, with such a massive army advancing on the city, it was clear that the Portuguese presence was now hanging on by its fingernails. Yet, in this dark hour, Portugal had a commander who rose up to answer the call to defend the city. However, with such long odds, this general would still need a miracle if he, his men, and his country's position were to survive. That all said, whether he was ready for it or not, the battle for Cochin had begun. The Tramumpara Raja, the king of Cochin, was a man who had many troubles. His throne was never secure, and it wasn't just the political factions that surrounded him, but members of his own family who were based in the nearby town of Edapali that were all maneuvering to seize his crown. To make matters even worse, he was a vassal to the Samudri Raja of Calicut, whose rule extended over many of the cities of the Malabar coast, including Cochin. Thus, the ruler of Cochin needed something, anything, to stay on top. Opportunity would soon present itself. When the Portuguese had arrived in the Indian Ocean, it wasn't long before war had broken out with Calicut. The Europeans had dealt with Samudri Raja one defeat after another. They had bombarded the city several times, and they had even destroyed the Calicut fleet. As a result, many of the city-states in the Malabar coast rose up in defiance. Cochin was among them. The Trimampara Raja, again the king of Cochin, had welcomed in the Portuguese with open arms. He allowed them to continue their trade in spice, thus made them extremely wealthy, and allowed them to build a fortress in the city. But now matters had taken a dramatic change for the worse. The king of Cochin now looked out at his city. It was still rebuilding. It was not that long ago that it had been burned to the ground. In February of 1503, Vasco da Gama, the Admiral of India, had left the Indian Ocean with his armada. He had left behind a flotilla of ships to guard Cochin, but those captains had abandoned their post in search of plunder in the Red Sea and were subsequently destroyed. By April of that year, the Samudri Raja, also known as the Zamorin, had sensed their weakness. He raised a massive army of 50,000 warriors in Calicut and had marched on Cochin. The Trimampara Raja had at best 5,500 warriors, whom he placed under the command of his heir, Prince Narayan. The warrior prince had marched out, and at the town of Edapally he put up a stout defense at the ford of a river. Though outnumbered nearly 10 to 1, Narayan was able to hold off 2 direct assaults. Roger Crowley, in the book Conquerors, brings justice to this valiant stand. Quote, after having some initial military success, the Samudri Raja bribed the prince's men into disaffection, and Narayan was killed. The territory of Cochin was eventually overrun, but according to the laws of the Hindu military caste, the 200 surviving members of the prince's army swore themselves to ritual death. They shaved off all their hair and advanced towards Calicut, killing everyone they met until they had been hacked down to the last man. This sacrifice bought the king and the Portuguese time. They retreated from Cochin to the offshore island of Vaipin. The Samudri Raja of Calicut thus entered Cochin and burned the city to embers, but he wasn't able to reach the island of Vaipin as the monsoon weather had set in. The Samudri fell back to Calicut as rain and rough seas started to batter the Malabar coast. However, he swore to return in August and destroy all those who resisted him. End quote. In late August of 1503, the Zamorin returned, but as he prepared to lay siege to the island of Vaipin, his scouts reported the arrival of an incoming force. 2 well-armed ships had just entered the harbor of Cochin. They were under the command of Francisco de Albuquerque, a military man with a very short temper. A few days later, another 4 ships would also arrive. This new flotilla just happened to be under the command of Francisco's cousin. His name was Alfonso de Albuquerque. This man possessed a natural flair for combat, and his confidence was justified. He was dedicated to warfare. In his nearly 5 decades of life, he had fought the Arabs in North Africa, the Ottomans in Italy, and the Castilians in Portugal. Alfonso was destined to also make a name for himself in the Indian Ocean. In time, he would become one of the most impressive military commanders in history. These 6 ships were a contingent of the 5th Portuguese Armada. Their presence was immediately felt. The Zamorin, the Samudri Raja...
Alright, I'll give it another like half hour, and then I may never play this level again in my life.
Predicted correctly that the Portuguese Armada would once again have to leave. Make no mistake, the Samudri was definitely going to be back, and this time with great...
But I'll give it a good half hour more.
Francisco de Albuquerque immediately took the credit for, quote, routing the army at Calicut. However, all the Portuguese commanders knew that Cochin was by no means out of danger. They had to move fast. A punitive raid was launched in the Bandanat Lagoon. Villages that had helped the Zamorin were attacked and destroyed. The city of Edapally, where the rival family members of the king of Cochin lived, was brutally razed to the ground, and many of those rivals were put to death. The Portuguese, after all, were not going to take any chances with someone else coming to power in Cochin. In record time, Fort Santiago, later named Fort Manuel, was built at the mouth of the harbor. Inside of the fort, the Portuguese built their first church in India, named São Bartholomew. Their message was clear: the Europeans were here to stay. Afonso de Albuquerque, meanwhile, led negotiations with the Queen Regent to the city of Colón, where spices were purchased and another Portuguese factory was to be built. However, the monsoon winds were shifting, and the time to leave was quickly approaching. In late January of 1504, the 5th Portuguese Armada departed for home. Its journey would be ill-fated. Francisco de Albuquerque hit rough weather in the Mozambique Channel and was never heard from again. Of the 10 ships that had been part of the Armada, only 5 made it back to Portugal. And those that did, including the one carrying Afonso de Albuquerque, only barely made it. However, before Afonso left, he made a decision that would forever shape the Portuguese fortune in India. Afonso had placed one of his most skilled and articulate captains in charge of the defense of Cochin. That man's name was Duarte Pacheco Pereira. Duarte Pacheco Pereira was born in Lisbon in the year 1460. He was the embodiment of a Renaissance man. He was intelligent, well-educated, inquisitive, and perfectly at home on the battlefield. The great poet Luís de Camões would describe him as the Portuguese Achilles in the epic poem Lusíadas, where he was described as having a pen in one hand and a sword in the other. Duarte seemed to have been involved everywhere in the early Portuguese Empire. In 1475, he graduated with a formal education and would go on to become the King of Portugal's personal squire, where he would become extremely well acquainted with the intrigue of the court. Later, he would be involved in various expeditions along the coast of West Africa. When he got shipwrecked in one of his journeys, he was picked up and saved by Bartholomew Diaz on his famous return from the Cape of Good Hope. In 1494, Duarte was also involved in the critical Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese. In 1488, it was even hinted that he might have been the first European to have discovered the coast of South America, 2 years prior to the celebrated time of Cabral in 1500. He was an avid learner who wrote books on exploration, studied the interaction of primates, calculated the arc meridian to its most accurate degree, and was one of the first Europeans to scientifically understand the relationship between the moon and the tides. Indeed, the mathematical models he formulated were able to predict the rhythm of the tides better than anyone had ever done before. This last bit of knowledge, by the way, would one day, strangely enough, save his life. In early 1504, the Samudri of Calicut was busy at the work of logistics. He had called in reinforcements from across his domain to gather an army of 60,000 men. By some estimates, it was as high as 87,000. He had expanded his fleet to 260 ships, albeit many were relatively minor and somewhat fragile vessels, but they did have guns. From the Ottomans, the Samudri purchased over 300 smaller cannons, though they were a bit obsolete. The Venetians, meanwhile, had secretly dispatched 2 agents that had technical knowledge which allowed the King of Calicut to forge 5 larger cannons. These Venetian guns, by the way, were powerful enough to destroy Portuguese ships. The Portuguese, on the other hand, had 150 men, along with 3 ships, 2 caravels, and 1 carrack. The Trimonpada Raja rallied his army and sent out a plea for mercenaries. He was hoping for 30,000 recruits. Only 8,000 showed up, but many deserted, leaving about 5,000 Nayar warriors in the end. Duarte Pereira had been well informed of what his opponent was doing. During the course of the entire battle, the Portuguese commander's intelligence service was exceptional. It revealed his enemy's movements, composition, supply chains, everything, down to the 5 Venetian cannons that the Samudri had made. Pereira first made it a point to bolster morale. He wanted everyone to know that the Portuguese were here to defend the city to the last. He stockpiled food, surveyed the land for the most defensible locations, and had his men build wooden stockades. He kept the population of Cochin from abandoning the city. Instead, he got taught them to work creating extra cannonballs.
Yo, Jersey, what's up?
He also had the people carve 12-foot-long
How are ya?
thousands of them.
How are you, Jersey?
Large wooden shields
It's like 4 a.m. there.
with mouths of cotton. Thus, his ships would be protected from small cannon fire. He
I'm not judging.
had to deploy his men. 39 men in the Carrack were positioned at Fort Manuel. Some of the men were placed in the city of Cochin, and the rest
Thanks for being here.
deployed along the lagoon.
Oh no, that sucks.
In these narrow forests
That sucks, I'm sorry.
the wooden spears were drilled
Get better now. Remember when you said that to me?
to slow a person's movement.
You like put like a spell on me, say get better now. I'm doing that to you, get better now.
The 5,000 Nayar warriors at Cochin were also positioned alongside the Portuguese men. Now all that was
Yeah.
was to await the arrival of the Samudri.
I felt guilty. You like guilted me into feeling better.
On March 31st, 1504, the Zamorin of Calicut arrived. He moved in on the
It
fort
worked.
of Cumbalan with the intent to cross the lagoon and advance on the city. Here, Herrera decided to make his stand, but the sudden appearance of over 60,000 warriors at Calicut shattered his men's morale. Many fled, leaving only 90 Portuguese and a few hundred Nayar. Work immediately deployed all three of his ships to the
It worked.
The Samudri Raja countered this by bringing up his big Venetian cannons. Herrera put
Maybe you were like
them
doing a prayer.
He had his men keep up the sporadic fire on the cannons, which in turn dispersed their crews. The three ships then quickly turned around and began to fire on anyone who attempted to cross the ford.
I thought it was like some voodoo.
Raja in turn
I thought it was some West Indies voodoo. No, it's true.
over 150 ships moved in, but it was low tide, so only a handful could make it through the shallow waters of the lagoon at a time. The Portuguese sailors brought their guns to bear and began to pick them off in piecemeal. When the Indians attempted to return fire with their smaller cannons, the cannonballs simply bounced off the padded wooden shields. That day, wave after wave after wave of naval attack was sent.
Caribbean voodoo, yeah.
Failed as the Calicut death toll soared. The carnage became so bad that even the wreckage of the Indian ships became an obstacle. Without this much needed naval support, the Samudri would not dare have his men cross the Cumbalan ford. By midday, he called off the attack. It was a humiliating beginning for the King of Calicut. At least 30 ships destroyed and
Oh my gosh.
casualties. But the Raja was by no means done.
Well, I hope you feel better.
On April 7th, a week later, the Samudri Raja attacked again. His plan this time was a two-pronged assault. The first portion was a diversionary naval attack on the city. If the Portuguese raced to secure Cochin, they would leave the pass of Cumbalan open, at which time the Raja of Calicut could cross with his men and attack. Of course, it wasn't long before Duarte Herrera knew of this strategy and planned accordingly. The Portuguese commander positioned his stronger caravan at the mouth of the harbor and left his two faster caravans at the Cumbalan ford. The caravan was soon fighting off the enemy. Herrera had his faster caravans race to assist the caravan. When the Samudri's men saw the incoming ships, they realized that they were going to be caught in a crossfire. They brought down their sails. They quickly retreated. Duarte knew that the tide was going out. At low tide, the ford of Cumbalan could be crossed. He had all three of his ships get back to it as fast as they could. The Portuguese flotilla arrived just in the nick of time and began to unleash their guns on anything that moved. The Raja's fleet was battered, and anyone attempting to cross the ford soon found themselves in a watery grave. This time, the Samudri would lose 19 ships and 300 men. Duarte wasted no time. The next day, on April 8th, he took the offensive and had his ships launch a series of attacks along the entire lagoon. At key locations, the Portuguese would make landfall to destroy the Raja's supply and prove that his soldiers were vulnerable even in their camps. While these attacks didn't do much damage, it did psychologically stun the warriors of Calicut, greatly angered the Samudri Raja, who now fiercely wanted those Portuguese ships destroyed. On April 9th, 1504, the Zamora redeployed his Venetian guns near the city of Cochin, where the Portuguese fleet had taken anchor. The battery of guns that were placed were heavily defended with wooden ramparts. in mind that these guns were powerful enough to demolish the ships, and they had the range to hit them, but their crews were inexperienced and lacked the precision to hit their targets. One volley after another fell short. Duarte commanded his men to do nothing. For several
It's
hours,
reading
the
our
Venetian
chat
guns
right
fired
now.
without hitting anything, and without taking
It's
any
updating
reprisals.
AI real
This
time
confused the Samudri and
based on what you write
came to the decision that
in
the
this chat.
Portuguese must be out of
Oh, that
ammunition.
was so close.
The Venetian guns were moved out of their protective positions to get a better shot, and the Calicut fleet decided to sail in to take advantage of what seemed like an obviously golden opportunity. This was precisely what Duarte Pereira was waiting for. At point-blank range, the Portuguese fleet came to life. One volley after another was unleashed, smashing the Raja's ships to pieces. And when the wind turned to their favor, Duarte's men sailed up to the now
Would be a
exposed
trip.
Venetian guns and utterly
That would be
destroyed
wild.
them. It demoralized the Samudri Raja was forced to retreat his forces. Once again, his casualty list was extensive. It was in late April that Duarte's spies reported that the Zamorin had taken down his camp at the Cumbalong Ford and had started to march north. At first it seemed that the forces at Calicut were done and were retreating back to their city, but soon it became apparent that they were only maneuvering into a new position at the island of Arau. The Samudri Raja had regained his nerve for battle and was now ready to unleash everything he had. Duarte Pereira had previously surveyed the island of Arau in detail. It was the closest island to the peninsula that Cochin sat on. A mere 500 feet of water separated the two. In the northern part of the island was the fort of Palagnar, and in the southern
Why?
portion was
Why?
the fort of Palerti. With
What?
only about 150 men, there was no way the Portuguese could defend both.
How did I not
Duarte
get the
knew
B
that the Samudri
press?
was counting on this, but he also knew a lot about the forts. He knew that Palagnar in the north was fordable on foot only at low tide, and that Palerti in the south was only fordable with ships at high tide, as the ferries could not operate in shallow water. As mentioned before, the Portuguese commander had done his research on tides. He knew exactly when the low and the high tides would be. He thus planned accordingly. 2 stockades were built at both passes, spikes and spears were drilled into the fort waterway.
Everything is gonna be
Duarte had his
okay,
men prepared
Jonesy.
back and forth
Don't be
quickly
stressed.
with their cannons. Before the Samudri Raja had even positioned himself on the island, Duarte had his men enter the island to cut down all the trees and vegetation so that there would be absolutely no cover. On May 1st, 1504, the Zamorin attacked in force. It was high tide, which meant the attack would come in the south at the fort of Palerti.
Oh, no way. Why?
Four batteries began opening fire on the Zamorin's men, who were preparing to embark on their ferries. As there was no vegetation to hide in, they made easy targets. And when the Samudri's men attempted to
That's
set up
not.
their
That's
own
not good.
targets, they too were easily picked off. In fact, at certain points, the
I'm sorry to hear that.
Portuguese would come ashore, rush the Indian batteries, and spike the cannons to explode. The Samudri Raja's ships were once again no match for the Portuguese caravans. They were decimated by concentrated gunfire. This fighting went on for hours, and soon the tide went out. Duarte now knew it was time to shift to the northern fort of Palagnar.
Oh, I'm sorry.
As predicted, the Zamorin had a column of shock troops sent in, but even before they could enter the fort, they came under intense cannon fire. Those that did make it into the lagoon moved
That's
slowly.
not fair to you.
Some of these soldiers had their feet impaled on the spikes that the engineers had put in and drilled into the shallow waters, making them move even slower. They made little progress and took heavy casualties, but at the same time, the situation for the Portuguese
I'm
in the
sorry.
fires of Cochin was becoming desperate. Many were wounded and exhausted. Supplies and ammunition were running low. It became evidently clear that the defenses that Duarte had in place were simply not enough. Now, had the Samudri
Yeah,
The battlefield, nobody could move.
it's hard
Of
to
course, a massive
voice your
cholera epidemic
opinion
broke out in the Zamorin's
without
camp.
getting upset.
In the course of the coming week, cholera would claim
It's
over
like Jedi
10,000
style.
men. That week gave the Portuguese time to greatly
I
strengthen their
understand
defenses.
you though.
Larger stockades, more spikes
I've
in
done
the
that
water, and
before.
rest for the men. They were gonna need it. On May 7th, 1504, the Zamora launched its largest assault yet. It was divided into three contingents. 12,000 men made up the front, another 12,000 men in the second wave, and
I'm sorry.
15,000 along with engineers to hack down the stockades brought up the rear. It was low tide, so once again
Oh, I'm
the
sorry.
crossing would have to be at the ford of Alagnar. The Portuguese were estimated to have about 100 men, along with
I
about
really am.
200 warriors of Cochin, from roughly 300. But in that narrow corridor, they were determined to make the Zamoran's numbers count for nothing. The Zamoran gave the command for his army to advance and take the opposite bank. They were
Boomer's gonna boomer.
gunfire. The soldiers of Calicut waded into the water, which slowed down their progress. When they hit the embedded spikes and had their feet impaled, they went even slower. However, the Zamoran's military timetable had not anticipated this. The second and the third wave came up precisely when they were supposed to. But the slowed movement of that first wave forced them all together. They became compacted into one giant mass of human bodies, all slowly making their way across the water. Duarte now had all of his cannons direct their fire into this mountain. The results were horrific. Cannonballs hit the mob of men, gutting open large swathes. Some incoming rounds would tear their way through 5 or even 6 lines of men. Portuguese precision was spot on. At one point, a talented gunner even fired directly at the Zamoran's tent, killing one of the king's aides right next to him. As the day progressed, the artillery was relentless, and yet the Zamoran threw
What?
even more men
Wait,
into
how
the
did I
fight.
miss that slab?
Surprisingly, his men made it to the opposite bank. There they had to overcome a stockade, but some of the defenders abandoned their positions and ran for their lives. It would seem that the Zamoran had achieved his goal. But then the tide came in and stopped all progress. The warriors of Calicut were now reduced to swimming back in the middle of cannon fire. This attack would be one of the most costly defeats the Samudri had to endure, but he knew he had come within a hair's breadth of victory. Analyzing everything that had happened, the king of Calicut now came up with one final plan to crush his enemy.
Yeah, it doesn't seem very fair.
3 weeks later, in late May, he had 30,000 men positioned at the ford of Palagnar. At the ford of Palokti, he had his men create floating castles, essentially large lumbering rafts with towers and heavily reinforced walls. Each had the capacity to hold a large contingent of men. At high tide, he had his castles begin drifting across the water, spearheaded by fire barges. Duarte sent in his ships. They were able to evade the fire barges, but their cannons were ineffective
I'm glad
against
you're
the
chilling.
strong walls of the floating fortresses. The Zamoran's men had nearly made
Listen
it
to
the
some
other
meditation
side.
music
Things
if
were
you
looking
can.
very grim for the Portuguese. Duarte was remembered as uttering the line, "Lord, don't make me pay for my sins just yet." He then had all of his ships concentrate their fire on a single leading floating castle. Now, while it was not enough firepower to destroy it, it was able to undo the structural integrity of the craft. The castle literally began to come undone, and its heavy weight caused it to drag
Like
along the
why?
bottom. Eventually, it got stuck. Seeing this, the same process was repeated on the rest of the Zamoran's fleet, which slowed them down. And then the tide went out, getting them all stuck in the mud. Duarte had his men quickly board the castles, set them on fire, and then had them escape as the tide went out. Many of the men on those floating fortresses never made it back. Meanwhile, to the north, at the ford of Palagnar, with the low tide, the Zamoran's men began to cross. But by now, Pereira had his men and his ships redeployed. At the fort, they would repeat their performance in the prior assault. Once again, they would dish out massive carnage. And once again, the Zamoran's attack would fail. That day, the Zamoran had the greatest aftermath, his nerves were shattered, the morale of his men destroyed. Other assaults would be ordered over the next few days, but they would never have the same resolve or fortitude again. On June 24th, 1504, the King of Calicut, now a broken man, abdicated his throne. He would pass his crown on to his nephew and heir, Prince Nalbiadani. Now with poor weather coming in and few other options, the army of Calicut retreated on July 3rd. The Battle of Cochin was over. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the King of Portugal, Manuel I, had laid down the plans to launch the 6th Portuguese Armada. It was a powerful force, built with the assumption that Cochin and the other Malabar city-states had likely already fallen. Thus, this new armada was prepared for a massive fight. But when the ships arrived in the Indian Ocean, they were in for a shock. Roger Crowley explains, quote, "The fleet that relieved Cochin in the autumn of 1504 was substantial. 14 carracks, including 5 large and newly built ones, each carrying a substantial complement of soldiers, sailors, and great firepower." With news of Pereira's great victory and the Samudri's abdication resounding up and down the Malabar coast, these new arrivals made a powerful impression on the trading cities and their rulers. The word was out. The Portuguese were evidently invincible. End quote. Duarte Pacheco Pereira had saved Cochin and arguably the Portuguese Empire in India. He would return to Lisbon in 1505 to a hero's welcome. Eventually, he
We're saying, come on, please.
Pereira
Please.
would continue to explore and engage in his mathematical pursuits. However, for a man who gave so much for his country, he was ironically brought down by the intrigue of the Portuguese court. He was falsely accused of corruption and theft, briefly imprisoned, eventually exonerated, but he would never regain his former fame. He would die in obscurity in 1533. Yet, his contribution was undeniable. Portugal, a small, impoverished country only a few decades back, was now on the cusp of incredible greatness. The time of discovery was over. The sea passage to India had become essentially a highway. The time of commerce, creating new trade routes and outposts, was well established. The money was flowing in. Now, the King of Portugal was about to unleash 2 incredibly gifted military commanders, Francisco de Almeida and Alfonso de Albuquerque. The time of conquest had begun. The Trimampara Raja, the king of Cochin, was a man who had many troubles. His throne was never secure, and it wasn't just the political factions that surrounded him, but members of his own family who were based in the nearby town of Idapali that were all maneuvering to seize his crown. To make matters even
Probably gonna
worse,
stop
he was
streaming soon.
to the Samudri Raja of Calicut, whose rule extended over many of the cities of the Malabar coast, including Cochin. Thus, the ruler of Cochin needed something, anything, to stay on top.
Maybe
Opportunity would seem to
15 more minutes, maybe.
When the Portuguese had arrived in the Indian Ocean, it wasn't long before war had broken out with Calicut. The Europeans had dealt the Samudri Raja one defeat after another. They had bombarded the city several times, and they had even destroyed the Calicut fleet. As a result, many of the city-states of the Malabar coast rose up in defiance. Cochin was among them. The Trimampara Raja, again the king of Cochin, had welcomed in the Portuguese with open arms. He allowed them to continue their trade in spice, thus made them extremely wealthy, and allowed them to build a fortress in the city. But now matters had taken a dramatic change for the worse. The king of Cochin now looked out at his city. It was still rebuilding. It was not that long ago that it had been burned to the ground. In February of 1503, Vasco da Gama, the Admiral of India, had left the Indian Ocean with his armada. He had left behind a flotilla of ships to guard Cochin, but those captains had abandoned their post in search of plunder in the Red Sea and were subsequently destroyed. By April of that year, the Samudra Raja, also known as the Zamora, had sensed their weakness. He raised a massive army of 50,000 warriors in Calicut and had marched on Cochin. The Travancore Raja had at best 5,500 warriors, whom he placed under the command of his heir, Prince Narayan. The warrior prince had marched out, and at the town of Edapali, he put up a stout defense at the ford of a river. Though outnumbered nearly 10 to 1, Narayan was able to hold off to the lake itself. Roger Crowley, in the book Conquerors, brings justice to this valiant stand. Quote, after having some initial military success, the Samudri Raja bribed the prince's men into disaffection, and Narayan was killed. The territory of Cochin was eventually overrun, but according to the laws for the Hindu military caste, the 200 surviving members of the prince's army swore themselves to ritual death. They shaved off all their hair and advanced towards Calicut, killing everyone they met until they had been hacked down to the last man. This sacrifice bought the king and the Portuguese time. They retreated from Cochin to the offshore island of Vaipin. The Samudri Raja of Calicut thus entered Cochin and burned the city to embers, but he wasn't able to reach the island of Vaipin as the monsoon weather had set in. The Samudri fell back to Calicut as rain and rough seas started to batter the Malabar coast. However, he swore to return in August and destroy all those who resisted him. End quote. In late August of 1503, the Zamorin returned, but as he prepared to lay siege to the island of Vaipin, his scouts reported the arrival of an incoming force. 2 well-armed ships had just entered the harbor of Cochin. They were under the command of Francisco de Albuquerque, a military man with a very short temper. A few days later, another 4 ships would also arrive. This new flotilla just happened to be under the command of Francisco's cousin. His name was Alfonso de Albuquerque. This man possessed a natural flair for combat, and his confidence was justified. He was dedicated to warfare.
I'm sorry you're going through that journey. What does your father think about that? Does he know?
In time, he would become one of the most impressive military commanders in history. These 6 ships were a contingent to the 5th Portuguese Armada. Their presence was immediately felt. The Zamorin, the Samudri Raja, dismantled his siege and withdrew his army. He decided to hold off hostilities till early the next year, where he predicted correctly that the Portuguese Armada would once again have to leave. Make no mistake, the Samudri was definitely going to be back, and this time with greater numbers. Francisco de Albuquerque immediately took the credit for, quote, routing the army of Calicut. However, all the Portuguese commanders knew that Cochin was by no means out of danger. They had to move fast. A punitive raid was launched in the Vendanab Lagoon. Villages that had helped the Zamorin were attacked and destroyed. The city of Edapali, where the rival family members of the king of Cochin lived, was brutally razed to the ground, and many of those rivals were put to death. The Portuguese, after all, were not going to take any chances with someone else coming to power in Cochin. In record time, Fort Santiago, later named Fort Manuel, was built at the mouth of the harbor. Inside of the fort, the Portuguese built their first church in India, named São Bartolomeu. Their message was clear. The Europeans were here to stay. Alfonso de Albuquerque, meanwhile, led negotiations with the Queen Regent of the city of Colón, where spices were purchased and another Portuguese factory was to be built. However, the monsoon winds were shifting, and the time to leave was quickly approaching. In late January of 1504, the 5th Portuguese Armada departed for home. Its journey would be ill-fated. Francisco de Albuquerque hit rough weather in the Mozambique Channel and was never heard from again. Of the 10 ships that had been part of the Armada, only 5 made it back to Portugal. And those that did, including the one carrying Alfonso de Albuquerque, only barely made it. However, before Alfonso left, he made a decision that would forever shape the Portuguese fortune in India. Alfonso had placed one of his most skilled and articulate captains in charge of the defense of Cochin. That man's name was Duarte Pacheco Pereira. Duarte Pacheco Pereira was born in Lisbon in the year 1460. He was the man. He was intelligent, well-educated, inquisitive, and perfectly at home on the battlefield. The great poet Luís de Camões would describe him as the Portuguese Achilles in the epic poem Lusíadas, where he was described as having a pen in one hand and a sword in the other. Duarte seemed to have been involved everywhere in the early Portuguese Empire. In 1475, he graduated with a formal education and would go on to become the King of Portugal's personal squire, where he would become extremely well acquainted with the intrigue of the court. Later, he would be involved in various expeditions along the coast of West Africa. When he got shipwrecked in one of his journeys, he was picked up and saved by Bartholomew Diaz on his famous return from the Cape of Good Hope. In 1494, Duarte was also involved in the critical Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese. In 1488, it was even hinted that he might have been the first European to have discovered the coast of South America, 2 years prior to the celebrated time of Cabral in 1500. He was an avid learner who wrote books on exploration, studied the interaction of primates, calculated the arc meridian to its most accurate degree, and was one of the first Europeans to scientifically understand the relationship between the moon and the tides. Indeed, the mathematical models he formulated were able to predict the rhythm of the tides better than anyone had ever done before. This last bit of knowledge, by the way, would one day, strangely enough, save his life. In early 1504, the Samudri of Calicut was busy at the work of logistics. He had called in reinforcements from across his domain to gather an army of 60,000 men. By some estimates, it was as high as 87,000. He had expanded his fleet to 260 ships, albeit many were relatively minor and somewhat fragile vessels, but they did have guns. From the Ottomans, the Samudri purchased over 300 smaller cannons, though they were a bit obsolete. The Venetians, meanwhile, had secretly dispatched 2 agents that had technical knowledge which allowed the King of Calicut to forge 5 larger cannons. These Venetian guns, by the way, were powerful enough to destroy Portuguese ships. The Portuguese, on the other hand, had 150 men, along with 3 ships, 2 caravels, and 1 carrack. The Trimonpada Raja rallied his army and sent out a plea for mercenaries. He was hoping for 30,000 recruits, only 8,000 showed up, but many deserted, leaving about 5,000 Nayar warriors in the end. Duarte Pereira had been well informed of what his opponent was doing. During the course of the entire battle, the Portuguese commander's intelligence service was exceptional. It revealed his enemy's movements, composition, supply chains, everything down to the 5 Venetian cannons that the Samudri had made. Pereira first made it a point to bolster morale. He wanted everyone to know that the Portuguese were here to defend the city
not
to
it.
the last. He stockpiled food, surveyed the land for the most defensible locations, and had his men build wooden stockades. He kept the population of Cochin from abandoning the city. Instead, he got them to work creating extra cannonballs from stone. He also had the people carve 12-foot-long spears, thousands of them. Duarte then created large wooden shields for his ships, each were covered with knots of cotton. Thus, his ships would be protected from small cannon fire. He then began to deploy his men. 39 men were deployed in the position of Fort Manuel. Some of the men were placed in the city of Cochin, and the rest were deployed along the lagoon at various strategic crossing points. In these narrow fords and crossing points, the wooden spears were drilled into the lake bed at various depths. Some were embedded very deep to slow a person's
This game is just so cruel, man.
whereas other spears were positioned at a level that they would skewer a man alive if he fell on them. The 5,000 Nayar warriors of Cochin were also
Woman.
positioned alongside the Portuguese men. Now all that was left was to await the arrival of the Samudri and his army. On March 31st,
This is fast.
1504, the Zamorin of Calicut arrived. He moved in on the ford of Cambalan with the intent to cross the lagoon and advance on the city. Here, Pereira decided to make his stand, but the sudden
Not
appearance
fast
of over
enough.
60,000
Stuck.
warriors
It's not
in
it.
Calicut shattered his men's morale. Many fled, leaving only 90 Portuguese and a few hundred Nayar. Duarte immediately deployed all 3 of his ships to the ford. The Samudri Raja countered this by bringing up Venetian cannons, Herrera quickly responded to
What?
this new threat. He had his men keep
What?
up a sporadic fire on the cannons, which in
Oh.
turn dispersed their crews. The three ships then quickly turned around and began to fire on anyone who attempted to cross the ford or come along. The Raja in turn ordered a portion of his Calicut fleet to attack. Over 150 ships moved in, but it was low tide, so only a handful could make it through the shallow waters of the lagoon at a time. The Portuguese sailors brought their guns to bear and began to pick them off in piecemeal. When the Indians attempted to return fire with their smaller cannons, the cannonballs simply bounced off the padded wooden shields. That day, wave after wave after wave of naval attack was sent in. All of them failed as the Calicut death toll soared. The carnage became so bad that even the wreckage of the Indian ships became an obstacle. Without this much-needed naval support, the Samudri would not dare have his men cross the Cumberland Ford. By midday, he called off the attack. It was a humiliating beginning for the King of Calicut. At least 30 ships destroyed and 1,500 casualties. But the Raja was by no means done. On April 7th, a week later, the Samudri Raja attacked again. His plan this time was a two-pronged assault. The first portion was a diversionary naval attack on the city. If the Portuguese raced to secure Cochin, they would leave the pass of Cumberland open, at which time the Raja of Calicut could cross with his men and attack. Of course, it wasn't long before Duarte Pereira knew of this strategy and planned accordingly. The Portuguese commander positioned his stronger caravans at the mouth of the harbor. They left his two faster caravans at the Cumberland Ford. The caravan was soon fighting off the enemy. Pereira had his faster caravans race to assist the caravan. When the Samudri's men saw the incoming ships, they realized that they were going to be caught in a crossfire. They brought down their sails and quickly retreated. Duarte knew that the tide was going out. At low tide, the ford of Cumberland could be crossed. He had all three of his ships get back to it as fast as they could. The Portuguese flotilla arrived just in the nick of time and began to unleash their guns on anything.
What? How did I miss that?
Raja's fleet was battered, and anyone attempting to cross the ford soon found themselves in a watery grave. This time, the Samudri would lose 19 ships and 300 men. Duarte wasted no time. The next day, on April 8th, he took the offensive and had his ships launch a series of
Healthy
attacks
goose.
along the entire lagoon. At key locations, the Portuguese would make landfall to destroy the Raja's supplies and prove that his soldiers were vulnerable even in their camps. Now, while these attacks didn't do much damage, it did psychologically stun the warriors of Calicut and greatly angered the Samudri Raja, who now fiercely wanted those Portuguese ships destroyed. On April 9th, 1504, the Zamora redeployed his Venetian guns near the city of Cochin, where the Portuguese fleet had taken anchor. The battery of guns that were placed were heavily defended with wooden ramparts, making them impervious to bombardment. The Samudri made it a point to keep his vulnerable fleet back, hoping that his cannons could finish the job. Then, with a single command from the Raja, the cannons opened up and began firing on Pereira's ships. Now, keep in mind that these guns were powerful enough to demolish the ships, and they had the range to hit them, but their crews were inexperienced and lacked the precision to hit their targets. One volley after another fell short. Duarte commanded his men to do nothing. For several hours, the Venetian guns fired without hitting anything, and without taking any return fire. This confused the Samudri and his men, who came to the decision that the Portuguese must be out of ammunition. The Venetian guns were moved out of their protective positions to get a better shot, and the Calicut fleet decided to sail in to take advantage of what seemed like an obviously golden opportunity. This was precisely what Duarte Pereira was waiting for. At point-blank range, the Portuguese fleet came to life. One volley after another was unleashed, smashing the Raja's ships to pieces. And when the wind turned to their favor, Duarte's men sailed up to the now exposed Venetian guns and utterly destroyed them. A demoralized Samudri Raja was forced to retreat his forces. Once again, his casualty list was extensive.
Come on, man.
It was in late April that Duarte back to their city. But soon it became apparent that they were only maneuvering into a new position at the island of Aral. The Samudri Raja had regained his nerve for battle and was now ready to unleash everything he had. Duarte Pereira had previously surveyed the island of Aral in detail. It was the closest island to the peninsula that Cochin sat on, a mere 500 feet of water separated the two. In the northern part of the island was the fort of Palagnar, and in the southern portion was the fort of Palerti. With only about 150 men, there was no way the Portuguese could defend both. Duarte knew that the Samudri was counting on this, but he also knew a lot about the forts. He knew that Palagnar in the north was fordable on foot only at low tide, and that Palerti in the south was only fordable with ships at high tide, as the ferries could not operate in shallow water. As mentioned before, the Portuguese commander had done his research on tides. He knew exactly when the low and the high tides would be. He thus planned accordingly. 2 stockades were built at both passes, spikes and spears were drilled into the ford waterbeds. He also had his men prepared to move back and forth quickly along with their cannons. Before the Samudri Raja had even positioned himself on the island, Duarte had his men enter the island to cut down all the trees and vegetation so that there would be absolutely no cover. On May 1st, 1504, the Zamorin attacked in force. It was high tide, which meant the attack would come in the south at the ford of Palerti. Duarte had his men ready. His ships and shore batteries began opening fire on the Zamorin's men who were preparing to embark on their ferries. As there was no vegetation to hide in, they made easy targets. And when the Samudri's men attempted to set up their own cannons, they too were easily picked off. In fact, at certain points, the Portuguese sailors would come ashore, rush the Indian batteries, and spike the cannons to explode. The Samudri Raja's ships were once again no match for the Portuguese caravels. They were decimated by concentrated gunfire. This fighting went on for hours, and soon the tide went out. Duarte now knew it was time to shift to the northern fort of Palagnar. As predicted, the Zamorin had a column of shot troops sent in, but even before they could enter the fort, they came under intense cannon fire. Those that did make it into the lagoon moved slowly. Some of these soldiers had their feet impaled on the spikes that the engineers had Cochin and drilled into the shallow waters, making them move even slower. They made little progress and took heavy casualties, but at the same time, the situation for the Portuguese and the Nayars of Cochin was becoming desperate. Many were wounded and exhausted.
No! Like this game. Like I fucking hate this game. I really fucking hate this stupid game, man.
The Samudri Raja attacked again immediately, which he planned to do. He simply would have overwhelmed the defenders. However, that very night, gale force winds and heavy rain struck the battlefield. Nobody could move.
Sorry, I'll be chill. I won't be annoying. But man, that was really pissing me off.
Cholera would claim over 10,000 men. That week gave the Portuguese time to greatly strengthen all of their defenses. Larger stockades, more spikes in the water, and rest for the men. They were going to need it. On May 7th, 1504, the Zamorin launched his largest assault yet. It was divided into 3 contingents. 12,000 men made up the front, another 12,000 men in the second wave, and 15,000 along with engineers to hack down the stockades brought up the rear. It was low tide, so once again the crossing would have to be at the ford of Palagnar. The Portuguese were estimated to have about 100 men, along with about 200 warriors of Cochin, so roughly 300. But in that narrow corridor, they were determined to make the Zamorin's numbers count for nothing. The Zamorin gave the command for his army to advance and take the opposite bank. They were immediately under Portuguese gunfire. The soldiers of Calicut waded into the water, which slowed down their progress. When they hit the embedded spikes and had their feet impaled, they went even slower. However, the Zamorans' military timetable had not anticipated this. The second and the third wave came up precisely when they were supposed
what?
to. But the slow movement of that first wave forced them all together. They became compacted into one giant mass of human bodies, all slowly making their way across the water. Durant now had all of his cannons direct their fire into this mound. The results were horrific. Cannonballs hit the mob of men, gutting open large swathes. Some incoming rounds would tear their way through 5 or even 6 lines of men. Portuguese precision was spot on. At one point, a talented gunner even fired directly at the Zamorans' tent, killing one of the king's aides right next to him. As the day progressed, the artillery was relentless, and yet the Zamora threw even more men into the fight. Surprisingly, his men made it to the opposite bank. There they had to overcome a stockade, but some of the defenders abandoned their positions and ran for their lives. It would seem that the Zamora had achieved his goal. But then the tide came in and stopped all progress. The warriors of Calicut were now reduced to swimming back in the middle of cannon fire. This attack would be one of the most costly defeats the Samudri had to endure, but he knew he had come within a hair's breadth of victory. Analyzing everything that had happened, the king of Calicut now came up with one final plan to crush his enemy. Three weeks later, in late May, he had 30,000 men positioned at the fort of Palignar. At the fort of Palignar, create floating castles, essentially large lumbering rafts with towers and heavily reinforced walls. Each had the capacity to hold a large contingent of men. At high tide, he had his castles begin drifting across the water, spearheaded by fire barges. Durant sent in his ships. They were able to evade the fire barges, but their cannons were ineffective against the strong walls of the floating fortresses. The Zamorans' men had nearly made it to the other side, and things were looking very grim for the Portuguese. Durant was remembered as uttering the line, "Lord, don't make me pay for my sins just yet." He then had all of his ships concentrate their fire on a single leading floating castle. Now, while it was not enough firepower to destroy it, it was able to undo the structural integrity of the craft. The castle literally began to come undone, and its heavy weight caused it to drag along the bottom. Eventually, they got stuck. Seeing this, the same process was repeated on the rest of the Zamoran fleet, which slowed them down. And then the tide went out, getting them all stuck in the mud. Durant had his men quickly board the castles, set them on fire, and then had them escape as the tide went out. Many of the men in those floating fortresses never made it back. Meanwhile, to the north, at the ford of Palignar, with the low tide, the Zamorans' men began to cross. But by now, Pereira had his men and his ships redeployed. At the fort, they would repeat their performance in the prior assault. Once again, they would dish out massive carnage. And once again, the Zamorans' attack would fail.
I didn't want to ruin it. I took a really conservative door. I had to after the other tragedy.
Had the greatest number of casualties of
I
any
might have thrown it away.
In the aftermath, his nerves were shattered, the morale of his men destroyed. Other assaults would be ordered over the next few days, but they would never have the same resolve or fortitude again. On June 24th, 1504, the king of Calicut, now a broken man, abdicated his throne.
Should have done left strafe, I think, too. Yeah.
Now with poor weather coming in and few other options, the army...
I wonder if left strafe would have been better.
The Battle of Cochin was over. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the King of Portugal, Manuel I, had laid down the plans to launch the 6th Portuguese Armada. It was a powerful force, built with the assumption that Cochin and the other Malabar city-states had likely already fallen. Thus, this new armada was prepared for a massive fight. But when the ships arrived in the Indian Ocean, they were in for a shock. Roger Crowley explains, quote, "The fleet that relieved Cochin in the autumn of 1504 was substantial. 14 carracks, including 5 large and newly built ones, each carrying a substantial complement of soldiers, sailors, and great firepower. With news of Pereira's great victory and These new arrivals made a powerful impression on the trading cities and their rulers. The
She's
word
former?
was out. The Portuguese
Did she
were
retire?
invincible. End quote. Duarte Pacheco Pereira had saved Cochin and arguably the Portuguese Empire in India. He would return to Lisbon in 1505 to a hero's welcome. Eventually, he returned to being a Renaissance man. Pereira would write books, continue to explore, and engage in his mathematical pursuits. However, for a man who gave so much for his country, he was ironically brought down by the intrigue of the Portuguese court. He was falsely accused of corruption and theft, briefly imprisoned, eventually exonerated, but he would never regain his former fame. He would die in obscurity in 1533. Yet, his contribution was undeniable. Portugal, a small, impoverished country only a few decades back, was now on the cusp of incredible greatness. The time of discovery was over. The sea passage to India had become essentially a highway. The time of commerce, creating new trade routes and outposts, was well established. The money was flowing in. Now, the King of Portugal was about to unleash two incredibly gifted military commanders, Francisco de Almeida and Alfonso de Albuquerque. The time of conquest had begun. In early August of 1415, a vast Portuguese armada approached the coast of North Africa near the Strait of Gibraltar. Its primary objective, the city of Ceuta, came into view. The fleet consisted of 59 galleys, 33 carracks, and 120 support vessels. On board were 20,000 troops, with an additional 30,000 support personnel. The force was multinational, consisting of not only Portuguese men, but also recruits and mercenaries from France, England, and Germany. Years of meticulous planning went into this attack, which was arranged in the utmost of secrecy. The invasion force was led by the warrior King John I of Portugal, and by his side were his three sons, including his heir, Prince Edward. Ceuta was a fabulously wealthy city, a place where the trade routes of North Africa ended, and it was extremely strategic, being well placed on the Strait of Gibraltar. As such, its defenses were impressive. Over the centuries, it had been built into a fortress, defended by high walls and impressive towers. The Marinid dynasty, the current owners, had even gone so far as to add an imposing citadel. The Portuguese arrived with their fleet on August 12, 1415. As they entered the harbor, they immediately came under bombardment from the city. This initially prevented the Europeans from making landfall. Meanwhile, the governor of the city, Salah bin Salah, ordered the women and children to depart and brought in as many reinforcements as he could find. However, the Marinid Sultan, Abu Sayyad Usman III of Fez, due to massive internal upheaval that bordered on civil war, was unable to send in any further troops. King John of Portugal managed to reorganize his men for an attack on August 16th, but that very night a strong gale descended on the fleet, which literally scattered it to the wind. The next morning, with the Portuguese fleet absent, the defenders of the city came to the conclusion that the Europeans had given up. The governor, Salah bin Salah, made the decision to release his reinforcements, leaving only a small garrison, a decision he'd soon regret. It was on August 21st, 1415, that King John returned in force once again. Against the odds, he had brought his fleet together, and his soldiers were eager for battle. As before, the fleet sailed into the harbor. Landing craft that were loaded with troops were lowered into the water and then quickly made their way to the beaches. However, as the king was making his way to the shore, he was shot and wounded in the leg. His men began to falter. It was at this point that his son, a man by the name of Prince Henry, took up the royal standard and led the attack onwards. Flanked by his brother, Prince Edward, the heir to the throne, and supported by 300 men, Henry advanced to the Al-Madinah Gate, which was poorly defended. Due to the speed of Henry's attack, the gate was not properly secured and was soon smashed open. A massive breach would follow as King John arrived at the gate with the rest of the army. The Portuguese poured into the city and brushed aside the defenders. This small, outnumbered garrison was able to resist fiercely at first, but eventually they had to break and run. Salah bin Salah retreated to his citadel, but he remained there only for a night. It was during that night that he realized that his options were very limited. He decided to use the cover of darkness and fled the city as well. The very next day, all resistance in Ceuta came to an end, at which point the flag of Lisbon was hoisted above the battlements of the city. The Portuguese Empire had begun. By the late 14th century, Portugal was a relatively impoverished nation. When King John came to power on April 6, 1385, he inherited a kingdom that seemed to have a relatively dismal future. The kingdoms of Central Europe, on the other hand, were growing as the Renaissance in certain areas was beginning. The city-states of Italy, especially Genoa and Venice, which had a monopoly on trade to the Orient, were growing immensely wealthy. As can be imagined, this was envied by just about everybody else. Portugal, meanwhile, was missing out. It was on the extreme periphery.
I think it's my last run of the night.
Raleigh would say it was the prow of Europe. The kingdom had a long coastal border that looked on towards the menacing, seemingly endless Atlantic Ocean. An ocean, by the way, that the Arabs would call the Green Sea of Darkness. To the east,
Just so dumb. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. I may never go for this time ever again.
Castile invaded with a strong army. At the Battle of Aljubarrota on August 14, 1485, the Portuguese king, despite being outnumbered by nearly 5 to 1, achieved a decisive victory. His position as a sovereign was secured, and the House of Aviz, which he founded, would last for nearly 200 years. In the aftermath of this battle, King John was able to focus on the task of expanding his realm. 30 years later, he and his sons stood as conquerors of the city of Ceuta. Roger Crowley, in the book Conquerors, describes this moment well. Quote, "The Portuguese had come to wash their hands in infidel blood. They fulfilled their contract to the letter. 3 days of pillage and massacre then ransacked the place once described as the flower of all other cities in Africa, its gateway and its key. This stunning coup served notice to European rivals that the small kingdom was self-confident, energetic, and on the move."
Oh, is he signing off?
On August 24, 1415, in what had once been the city's mosque, now converted into a church known as Our Lady of Africa, a rightfully proud King John knighted his sons. Prince Henry's moment had finally come. The prince